All right. Welcome, everybody, to American Orthodoxy Episode 3. I'm your host, Benjamin Michael. Thank you for joining me again this week. This is going to be my last stream of the week, as I will be traveling this Saturday, but I will be back streaming again next Tuesday. Today is a highly requested stream, as I have been getting DMs over the last several months, ever since Michael Lofton sort of put this debate behind a paywall. And so I'm going to be reacting to the full debate. This is going to be a very long stream. It's going to be over 3 hours because the debate itself is almost 3 hours. I'm not going to talk much. I want you guys to be able to enjoy the debate yourself. And so I'm going to play the full debate, just a little bit of background of the context of this. So this was January of 2024. I was not a catechumen. A lot of people will call me sort of the Orthodox catechumen debater. It's false. It's actually a misconception. I never once debated as a catechumen. I debated as an inquirer, which some would argue is worse. However, I wasn't, part of an Orthodox church or anything at this point. This was, in many ways, I did this debate actually to test myself and to sort of test my arguments before converting. And so that's kind of the context of this debate. It was a huge blessing that I was able to go on Lofton's channel and debate Voice of Reason. This was also his first ever debate. And we were debating over the papacy in the first millennium. And I was presenting what are common Orthodox or also Anglican arguments against the papacy. And he was, of course, representing the Roman Catholic position, himself being a Byzantine Catholic. So I don't want to delay this much further. I'm trying to think if I have anything else to say about this debate going in. I do, like I said, I have a few notes. I had one blunder, I had a couple blunders, a few things that I misunderstood as far as theology. So I'll correct myself on those. I'm not going to address like every single one of his arguments, as he just kind of info blasts. And you guys will see in his opening statement, it's just like he literally just info blasts. I will address, some of the arguments that people found convincing that I didn't address in the debate, and I will correct myself on a few things. But I was watching my opening statement. I feel like I actually did a reasonable job, given the fact that I was just an inquirer at the time. And huge shout out to Ubi, because he was actually coaching me behind scenes leading up to the debate, not during the debate, nothing like that, but he was helping me prepare for the debate. He helped with my opening statement and things of that nature. So here we go. Are you guys ready? You guys excited to be here? I'm excited to be here. I think this is going to be a fun stream. As you can see, pretty long, 2 hours, 47 minutes. So we're going to be here a while, and I think we'll have a lot of people that will, watch this back, and because I know that this is a highly requested debate. Before I get into this, just real quick, just to plug myself, thank you so much for helping me with my clips. My clips have been doing really well, especially I posted one yesterday that did excellent on Instagram. So please follow me at RealBenMichael on all my platforms, especially Twitter and Instagram, because I post clips from this show over there to try to drive traffic over here. Thank you guys for making those clips a success so far. And then also, as many of you know, as I've been saying, I don't have YouTube monetization yet. So my Streamlabs link is pinned in the comments. I really appreciate the super chats, as I'm doing streaming. I'm doing content full time now. So my super chat link is right there, pinned in the comments for Streamlabs. I apologize. It's only through PayPal right now. Until I get monetized on YouTube. However, my Venmo link is also in the description. So with that, let us get started here.
O Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of Truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life, come and dwell within us, cleanse us of all stain, and save our souls, O gracious one. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show here on Reason and Theology. Got a debate for you today. Vatican I papal supremacy, is it present in the first millennium? Joined by Luigi, who is an Orthodox inquirer, and Alex, voice of reason, Eastern Catholic, and they're going to be debating that thesis. Before I get into the details and parameters and all that, I just want to invite or welcome both of y'all to the show. Let me start with you, Luigi, since this is your first time. Welcome to the show. How are you?
Thanks, man. Yeah, I'm happy to be here. I know this has been highly anticipated by me and a lot of my fellow debaters on TikTok and Instagram. So everybody's very excited for this.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an honor to have you. And tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. So by trade, I'm a Marine officer. However, I spend pretty much all my free time on TikTok, Instagram. I do response videos on Instagram, and then debating on TikTok. And yeah, just passionate about apologetics. I've been doing apologetics for pretty much my whole adult life. And then most recently, I began to inquire into Eastern Orthodoxy after about a 2-year journey away from, towards High Church Protestantism, and then now towards Orthodoxy. So
awesome. Well, again, welcome on board. And Alex, how are you, son?
I'm doing excellent, Michael. Thank you again for having me and for hosting this debate. I am super, ultra, mega excited to be doing this with my man Luigi, because Luigi is a great guy, and I think this is going to be great. I feel like I'm trying really hard to be like calm and cool like my man Luigi, but like inside, I'm so giddy and excited. I feel like I'm in my early 20s, and I'm like a female, and I'm going to like a Taylor Swift concert or something. That's how excited I feel. I'm just super excited to be doing this, because this is like my favorite thing to do. So thank both of you for doing this with me. And I want to give a shout out to my man Franco, because Franco Aurelio, Franco TV, he's the one that actually got you and I together,
Yes.
Luigi, to do this. Luigi, you reached out to Franco reached out to me.
Yeah.
And we got this debate set up. So I want everybody to know that this ex-Protestant who is becoming Orthodox, he challenged me. So this is a man right here. He's really about it. He came to me. He wants to do this. So I better be ready, because man, that's awesome. That's awesome. And thank you for your service, Luigi, and know that we're all praying for you, and we're really excited that you're on this journey to the apostolic faiths, and know that we're all praying for you, brother. And thank you for doing this here. You have nothing but friends here with me and Michael. We're your brothers, man. So thank you for being with us.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's an honor to have y'all. And so let me read to y'all just briefly from Pastor Eternus. And y'all can add anything else that y'all want to add to it as well. But just to define terms here, it notes this from Pastor Eternus, the First Vatican Council, in reference to papal supremacy, which again is the debate proposition. Vatican I, papal supremacy, present in the first millennium. It notes, wherefore we teach and declare that by divine ordinance, the Roman Church possesses a preeminence of ordinary power over every other church, and that this jurisdictional power of the Roman pontiff is both episcopal and immediate. Both clergy and faithful of whatever right and dignity, both singly and collectively, are bound to submit to this power by the duty of hierarchical subordination and true obedience, and this not only in matters concerning faith and morals, but also in those which regard the discipline and government of the church throughout the world. And so Alex is going to be taking the thesis that papal supremacy and Vatican I papal supremacy is present in the first millennium, and Luigi is going to take the negative position that it is not present in the first millennium. Now we are going to have opening statements, 2 opening statements. Alex is going to go first with 25 minutes, followed by Luigi with the same amount of time. Rebuttal period after that, 10 minutes apiece, beginning with Alex. Cross-examination period, 25 minutes apiece, again beginning with Alex questioning Luigi, and then after that, Luigi questioning Alex. That will then be followed by live Q&A. So we will have some questions from the audience, from y'all, your participation. Hold off towards the end of the cross-examination period before you start putting your questions in there, because I can promise you right now, you put it in before then, your question's just going to get lost in the chat. So hold off towards the end of Luigi's round where he's questioning Alex. I'll perhaps prompt y'all and remind y'all when to do so. But that way we will get your participation. We'll then have that Q&A time, and then it will be followed by closing statements, 5 minutes apiece with Alex, and then Luigi, he gets the final word. Okay, so gentlemen, y'all excited?
So ready.
Chomping at the bit. Let's get this
Yes,
done.
sir. And Michael, will you be keeping time for us, or do you need us to keep our own time?
Yes, I will. I have my timer right here.
And yeah, in regards to the time, like we discussed, I mean,
Mhm.
the big thing is getting our presentations done. Mine is within 25 minutes, brother. Like, take all the time you need to do your presentation. I mean, no one's.
Thank you, sir.
I think it's more edifying to everybody if we get our full presentations in. So,
Well,
Yeah.
thank you. That's actually what I was the most worried about. Was that my opening statement was the first time I practiced it. It was like 45 minutes, right? So I had to cut quite a bit of it out. So yeah.
And I'm a little flexible, so if like you're in the middle of a sentence at the end of the 25 minutes,
just a forewarning, his opening statement is like very, like, it's very boring. It's a lot of information, and it's just sort of like an info blast. So just a forewarning before we get into this. I promise you the debate heats up. Especially when I have a chance to give my opening statement, and then of course the rebuttal period and the cross exam. The cross exam is the best part, of course.
that's fine. Just take a few more seconds to kind of wrap up that thought, and then that's
Perfect.
I'm not going to cut you off mid-sentence, though.
Perfect. So you'll be keeping time for us, then, Michael?
I will, and what I'll do is I'll probably pop in what you'll just see yourself speaking when you're doing your presentation. But when you see me pop in, that means you got 1 minute left. So just kind of, so when you see me pop in, just kind of know to wrap it up at that point.
All right. Sounds good. Sounds good.
Okay, so I got my timer for 25 minutes here. Alex, you're going to begin with your opening statement. You got 25 minutes. You let me know when you're starting, and I'll hit that timer.
Okay, thank you very much. I will begin now. In this debate, I will demonstrate that the Vatican I definition of papal supremacy is indeed present in the first millennium before the schism between East and West in 1054. I would like to begin with two quotes. In his book, His Broken Body, Understanding and Healing the Schism Between the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Churches, Orthodox priest Father Lawrence Klenwerk says this: since the times of Stephen, the Roman Church has consistently taught that her bishop is the successor of Peter in a unique sense, and that he holds by divine right a primacy of power over the universal church. In other words, Rome made no secret that her ecclesiology and concept of primacy were different than that of the East. This was expressed consistently and unambiguously by a number of popes commemorated as saints in the Orthodox Church, including such luminaries as Leo, Agatho, and Hadrian. As we have seen, this ecclesiology was accepted by a number of Eastern saints.
I'm not going to do this throughout, but I just want to make one comment. The Stephen Cyprian situation is like completely misunderstood and misrepresented by the West. And I was taught this in my Protestant book as well, that like St. Stephen's view is what became the normal view, which a lot of people don't understand. And for those of you that don't know, the issue is over rebaptism, over whether or not converts have to be rebaptized. And St. Cyprian says, look, we should rebaptize everyone. We should baptize everyone. And then Pope Stephen, he was the complete opposite. He wanted to baptize no one. So if you were even baptized like just in the name of Jesus, he considered that to be a valid baptism. And so actually St. Cyprian's view is what we see sort of being the normative view. Now, there's economia granted at like the Council of Nicaea, but if you read St. Basil's canons on this, he's very clear that it's much more sympathetic to St. Cyprian's view. So people think that like Pope Stephen had this like unilateral decision that that resulted in the universal church saying we ought to baptize only those who are not baptized in proper form, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That's totally false, because that wasn't even his view, first of all. And then second of all, that didn't become the view of the church. So not the normative view. So it's totally misrepresented the Stephen Cyprian controversy.
This is also affirmed by Catholic priest, scholar, and historian Father Richard Price, who in his translation of the Acts of the Council of Chalcedon says this: "The bishops of Rome, since ancient times, also called Papa or Pope, claimed the primacy over the church that derived from Christ's commission to Peter. Today, my opponent must demonstrate that this definition is not present in the first millennium, but my opponent has an uphill battle because the historical evidence is overwhelmingly on the side of Vatican I. History clearly shows that the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, has always been supreme in the Christian church. This is made evident by countless examples of the Pope exercising his universal authority. To be precise, there are at least 12 unique ways in which the popes of the first millennium exercised universal jurisdiction. These include, number one, binding the entire Christian church to doctrinal pronouncements, including definitively condemning heresies. Number two, settling matters of discipline in other territories outside of the West. Number three, convoking regional and provincial synods in the East. Number four, reversing the decrees of Eastern bishops and entire regional councils. Number five, having the sole authority of ratifying councils on the universal level and thus making them ecumenical. Number six, refusing to ratify certain councils, even those that Roman emperors convoked and that other bishops and even patriarchs participated in, thus making them null and void. Number seven, picking and choosing which individual canons were authoritative and making them universally binding. Number eight, rejecting other individual canons, making them null and void for the universal church. Number nine, excommunicating Eastern clerics and even entire Eastern regions from universal communion, and these excommunications being accepted by the rest of the church without protest. Number 10, removing Eastern deacons, presbyters, and even bishops from their positions and replacing them with new ones, either of his own choosing or by his personal acceptance. Number 11, setting doctrinal and disciplinary conditions for the readmittance of schismatics back into full communion with the universal church. And number 12, being the ultimate, definitive, authoritative, and universal court of appeals, whose final decisions no other bishop or synod of bishops could appeal. There are multiple examples of each of these in the historical record, and Vatican I's definition is explicitly attested to by saints who are revered in both the Catholic and Orthodox churches. Most importantly, this belief is explicitly taught by the ecumenical councils of the first millennium, which are considered to be the highest authority for the Orthodox Church, meaning that the ultimate authority in Orthodoxy actually points to an even higher authority, the bishop.
So those of you who are asking me to fast forward, I know this is boring. I can't fast forward because there are people that want to, that are going to want to watch this and see both sides. So that's why I'm going to play his entire opening statement.
Of Rome. This undeniable reality can be seen in every single century of the first millennium. In the first century, during the apostolic age, and while John the Apostle was still alive, Orthodox Saint Pope Clement of Rome wrote a letter to the church in Corinth in which he writes on behalf of the entire Church of Rome. He mentions that he's writing in response to an appeal made to Rome by the church in Corinth in order to deal with a schismatic group that arose in the territory. Pope St. Clement exercises his authority in this eastern territory and orders the schismatics in Corinth to submit to and obey the presbyters. The bishop in Corinth at this time would have been either Bishop Onesiphorus or Bishop Sosthenes, but the letter doesn't even mention the bishop. The church in Corinth healed this internal schism, not by appealing to its own bishop or any other bishops from the east around Corinth, or even by appealing to the Apostle John, who at this time would have been in Ephesus, which is a lot closer to Corinth than Rome is. Instead, they appealed to the Bishop of Rome, who responded by exercising his universal authority and healing the schism. Not only was his order obeyed, but many in the early church actually believed that St. Clement's letter to Corinth was part of sacred scripture. In the 2nd century, St Irenaeus of Lyon, who was a saint in the Orthodox Church, wrote this in his work Against Heresies, Book 3, Chapter 3, and I quote, "By pointing out here the successions of the bishops of the greatest and most ancient church known to all, founded and organized at Rome by the two most glorious apostles Peter and Paul, with that church, because of its superior origin, all the churches must agree, that is, all the faithful in the whole world, that it is in her that the faithful everywhere have maintained the apostolic tradition." This 2nd century quote from an Orthodox saint sounds exactly like what Vatican I teaches. Also in the 2nd century, Pope St. Victor excommunicated Theodotus of Byzantium for the heresy of adoptionism, and he did this without holding a synod, according to early church historian Eusebius. Theodotus was excommunicated by the Bishop of Rome, not by his own bishop in Byzantium. Another example of papal universal jurisdiction. Eusebius' ecclesiastical history also tells us about a controversy between Orthodox Saint Pope Victor and the churches in Asia Minor. Pope Victor threatened to excommunicate the churches in Asia Minor for celebrating Easter on a different day than the rest of the church. Pope Victor was able to call a synod in Asia Minor, according to Polycrates, Bishop of Ephesus, another example of supreme papal jurisdiction. And Pope Victor threatened to excommunicate all of Asia Minor, and nobody said that he didn't have the authority to do this, and no other bishop threatened him with excommunication. After learning that the churches in Asia Minor used the Jewish calendar because that was the calendar used by the two apostles who brought Christianity.
So I'm going to briefly comment on this, on these two examples that he just gave, because one thing that I didn't quite understand when I had this debate and I was giving my rebuttal, because I didn't address this sufficiently, is there's a difference between cutting off from the universal church, the Catholic Church, and just cutting off from your communion. So, in other words, the Pope does have the authority to, without a synod, cut off from communion with Rome. He has that authority. And that's all that's happening in these examples that he's giving. And Craig Trulio's book, Rise and Fall of the Papacy, does an excellent job of going over this. But the Pope does not have the authority to cut off a bishop from the Church Catholic, from the universal church, unless there is a synod that determined that that person is a heresy, or at least determined that the views that person held were heretical. Then they can do something more unilateral that's universal. But in this case, all that's happening is the Pope is cutting them off from his local communion. That's all that's happening, which Pope St. Gelasius, who is commonly cited as one of the most prominent Vatican I, proponents in the first millennium, he explicitly says that every bishop has a right to cut off communion from the rest, from their communion, from their jurisdiction. Every bishop has that authority. Well, in the modern Roman Catholic Church, only the Pope has that authority. So Pope St. Gelasius, who is literally cited as the most extreme as far as Vatican I's claims, as far as meeting Vatican I's claims, even he says something that is not in the modern Roman Catholic paradigm. So anyways.
Christianity to Asia Minor, John and Philip, the Pope didn't follow through with the excommunication, but the mere unopposed threat of excommunication is enough to show that the Pope had universal jurisdiction, even if it wasn't used in this case. In the 3rd century, Pope Cornelius condemned the Novatianist heresy by his own authority without a council, and even sent a letter to the Novatian Bishop of Antioch telling him that he had to not only accept him as the Pope, but also had to renounce the Novatian heresy. In this same century, Orthodox Saint Pope Stephen definitively and authoritatively taught against rebaptizing those who received baptism from schismatic groups. And Orthodox Saint Vincent of Lerins in the 6th century affirmed Pope Stephen's supreme jurisdiction. Pope Stephen excommunicated Saint Firmilian, Metropolitan Bishop of Caesarea, and even threatened the entire Synod of Carthage with excommunication for their stance on rebaptism. They changed their position to agree with the Pope. In the 4th century, according to Orthodox Saint Athanasius of Alexandria,
that didn't happen. They did not change their position. I don't even know what he's citing for that. That literally just didn't happen. I already went over this issue.
The Council of Nicaea was called to reaffirm what Pope St. Dionysius had already definitively defined in the year 260. The Pope wasn't at the council, but he appointed the presiding cleric. After the Council of Nicaea, Athanasius of Alexandria was deposed and excommunicated by Eusebians at the First Synod of Tyre in 335. Pope Julius summoned the Eastern bishops to Rome to review this decree. Notice that the Pope can summon Eastern bishops. This led to the Synod of Sardica in 343, which was an Eastern synod convoked by Pope Julius. Notice that the Pope can convoke Eastern synods. He commissioned Bishop Hoseus of Cordova, who previously presided over Nicaea I, to preside over the council and re-examine the excommunication of Athanasius. He was found innocent, and censure was passed on the Eastern bishops for having abandoned the council, and several of them were deposed and excommunicated. This was done by the authority of the Pope. The Synod of Sardica teaches that the Pope is the final court of appeals whose judgments are definitive and cannot be appealed themselves. Also in the 4th century, Orthodox Saint Pope Damasus wrote this, which was pronounced at the Synod of Rome in 382, and I quote, "Likewise, it is decreed, the Holy Roman Church has been placed at the forefront, not by conciliar decisions of other churches, but has received the primacy by the evangelic voice of our Lord and Savior, who says, 'You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. I will give to you the keys of the kingdom of heaven.' The first see, therefore, is that of Peter the apostle, that of the Roman Church." End quote. Robert B. Eno, Catholic priest and scholar, says this: from the pontificate of Damasus onward, documentary evidence is plentiful that the tone of papal correspondence is one of command, of supreme authority, and undisputed primacy, unclouded by hesitation or shadow of self-doubt. That's in his book, The Rise of the Papacy. And Ada Nichols, another priest and scholar, says this in his work, Rome and the Eastern Churches, that Damasus composed letters in a formal, chancery style modeled on imperial rescripts. In his public statements, he adopted the plural of majesty, using we rather than I, and addressed his fellow bishops as sons instead of brothers. This is what Vatican I teaches. In the 5th century, Pope Innocent wrote this, and I quote, "In seeking the things of God, you have acknowledged that judgment is to be referred to us, the Pope, and have shown that you know that is owed to the Apostolic See. If all of us placed in this position are to desire to follow the apostle himself, Peter, from whom the episcopate itself and the total authority of this name have emerged." In March of 422, Orthodox Saint Pope Boniface said to the Eastern Bishop of Thessalonica, Rufus, he said this: "We have directed to the Synod of Corinth such writings that all the brethren may know that there is to be no review of our judgment."
You guys are troopers on this. I think there's about 10 minutes left in his opening statement.
In fact, it has never been licit to deliberate again on that which has once been decided by the Apostolic See. To the entire Synod of Thessalonica, he wrote this, saying, "It is certain that the Roman Church is, as it were, like the head of its members of the churches spread throughout the whole world. If anyone cuts himself off from her, he is exiled from the Christian religion, since he no longer can share in the same fellowship." And to the Bishop of Macedonia, he wrote this: "No one has ever boldly raised his hands against the apostolic eminence, from whose judgments it is not permissible to dissent. No one has rebelled against this who did not wish judgment to be passed upon him." At the Council of Ephesus in 431, Orthodox Saint Cyril of Alexandria had to get permission from the Pope to excommunicate the Bishop of Constantinople, Nestorius, if found guilty of heresy. Saint Cyril wrote to Orthodox Saint Pope Celestine and said this: "We shall not publicly withdraw from communion with him until we have shared this matter with your religiousness. Therefore, be so good as to decree what you think right, and whether one ought to be in communion with him, or rather issue a public refusal on the grounds that no one can be in communion with one who holds and teaches such things." At the same ecumenical council, Philip the Legate says this: "We offer our thanks to the Holy and Venerable Synod that when the writings of our holy and blessed Pope had been read to you, you joined yourselves to the Holy Head also by your holy acclamations. For your blessedness is not ignorant that the head of the whole faith, the head of the apostles, is blessed Peter the Apostles." That's in Acts of the Council, session 2. Philip the Legate calls the Pope the head of the entire church, and the councils accepted this. Philip the Legate also said this at the council, which is what is quoted by Vatican I: There is no doubt, and in fact it has been known in all ages, that the Holy and Most Blessed Peter, Prince and Head of the Apostles, Pillar of the Faith, Foundation of the Catholic Church, received the keys of the kingdom from our Lord Jesus Christ. To him was given the power of loosing and binding of sins, who down to today and forever both lives and judges in his successors. The Holy and Most Blessed Pope Celestine is his successor and holds his place, and us he sent to supply his place.
So a lot of info there regarding the Council of Ephesus, and I don't hit all of it in my rebuttal. However, I just linked Ubi Petrus has a multi-part series that is dedicated just to this argument regarding the excommunication of Nestorius. So for those of you that really want to do a deep dive into what he's talking about, I know it's a lot of info.
In this Holy Synod. That's from session 3. In the year 449, the Roman Emperor convoked another council at Ephesus, which was attended by representatives of all the churches, including Rome. This council was initially accepted by all in attendance, but after the papal representatives returned to Rome and informed Pope Leo about what transpired at this council, he rejected it and made it null and void, labeling it a robber council. All of the other churches obeyed Pope Leo's decree, and neither Catholics or Orthodox hold to this council. Pope Leo was also an Orthodox saint, and he showed his supremacy over a council convoked by an emperor and accepted by the East.
The Patriarch of Constantinople at that council was literally beaten and then end up dying as a result of getting beaten at that council. But he thinks that the reason why we don't accept it is just because Rome didn't accept it. Bro, the most obvious robber synod ever, Ephesus 2. Give me a break.
Making it completely null and void. This is Vatican I ecclesiology. 2 years later, in 451, the Council of Chalcedon was called so that all of the bishops would sign off on and agree with Pope St. Leo's tome, which he believed was definitive and authoritative for the Universal Church. Pope St. Leo also wrote this in his letter to Anastasius, Bishop of Thessalonica, and I quote, "Although bishops have a common dignity, they are not all the same rank. Even among the most blessed apostles, they were alike in honor. There was a certain distinction of power. All were equal in being chosen, but it was given to one to be preeminent over the others." So today, through the bishops, the care of the universal church could converge in the one see of Peter, and nothing should ever be at odds with its head. Pope St. Leo teaches that the universal church is under the one see of Peter and calls it his head. This is also in Vatican I. The 6th century saw the healing of the Acacian schism, which happened when the Patriarch of Constantinople, Acacius, broke communion with the West after siding with the Roman Emperor and rejecting the Council of Chalcedon. The schism began in 484 and was healed by Pope Hermisdas, who was also an Orthodox saint. Pope St. Hermisdas promulgated what is now called the Formula of Hermisdas, which he sent to the East and required the Emperor Zeno, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and all of the other Eastern bishops who were in schism to sign it. This formula, which quotes Pope St. Boniface, says this: "The beginning of salvation is to preserve the rule of a correct faith and to deviate and in no respect from the constitution of the fathers. And because the teaching of our Lord Jesus Christ cannot be allowed to fail, thou art Peter, and upon this rock I'll build my church. These things which are said are proved by the effects of things, because in the apostolic see, religion has always been preserved without spot or blemish." All of the bishops in the East signed this formula, and the schism was ended by the power of the Pope. And Orthodox priest Father Alexander Schmemann quote says this about the formula of Pope Hermisdas, and I quote, "Even more characteristic of the eternal compromise with Rome was the signing of the formula of Pope Hermisdas by the Eastern bishops in 519, ending the 30-year schism between Rome and Constantinople. The whole essence of the papal claims cannot be more clearly expressed than in this document, which was imposed upon the Eastern bishops." End quote. The same century gave us the Fifth Ecumenical Council, Constantinople II. This council and the famous historical events surrounding it also clearly show papal supremacy. This council was convoked by the Roman Emperor Constantinople Justinian, who kidnapped the Pope from Rome and brought him all the way back to Constantinople and placed the Pope under house arrest. The emperor did this because he knew that he needed the Pope's ratification in order for Constantinople II to be a valid ecumenical council. He went through the trouble of kidnapping the Pope from Rome instead of just having the patriarch of his very own city ratify the council. The patriarchs of Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem were all closer to Constantinople than Rome was, but the emperor didn't seek the ratification of any of those bishops. In fact, the patriarchs of Constantinople, Alexandria, and Antioch were all appointed to these offices by Justinian himself, because he knew that they would all go along with whatever he wanted to do. Even though he
Don't worry, guys. It's almost done. It's like, I think, like 3 minutes left.
stacked all of the Eastern patriarchs in his favor, he still knew that the Pope, and only the Pope, could ratify the council. Pope Vigilius didn't want to have an ecumenical council, so Justinian had to kidnap him in order to forcefully persuade the Pope to ratify it. That's a whole lot of unnecessary trouble if all the patriarchs are equal or if councils are above popes. This fact alone proves papal supremacy, but the point is strengthened by what happens next. Pope Vigilius still refused to ratify the council, disregarding the emperor even while under house arrest. Nevertheless, the emperor convoked the council anyway, believing that he could persuade the Pope to ratify it eventually. The Pope, however, believed that he could operate apart from a council and achieve this goal all by himself, which is...
So I'm not commenting on this because I actually do go into extreme detail on this particular case study. And what he's saying is just complete and utter nonsense. You guys will see that when I actually give my opening statement.
Exactly what he did, and at first, he even wrote against the council while it was taking place. This actually led to the council excommunicating Pope Vigilius, even though the council singles out Pope Vigilius's authority in the very session that excommunicated him. It says, and I quote, "Although, therefore, Vigilius has already frequently condemned the 3 chapters in writing, and has done this also by word of mouth and in the presence of the emperor, and of the most glorious judges, and of many members of the synod, and has always been ready to smite with anathema the defenders of Theodore of Mopsuestia, Ibas, and Theodoret, yet he has refused to do this in communion with you and your synod." Constantinople II even says in the emperor's opening letter that the Pope's teaching is definitive, saying that the Pope wrote back to Rome saying that nothing might be undertaken against the Judicatum, a document that Pope Vigilius wrote. The same session even calls the Pope the head of the bishops, addressing him by saying, and I quote, "If your blessedness is willing to meet together with us and the most holy patriarchs and the most religious bishops, and to treat of the 3 chapters and to give in unison with us all a suitable form of the Orthodox faith, we will hold you as our head, as a father and primate," end quote.
So one thing I don't mention when I go over the case study here, Vigilius, when he repents, Pope Vigilius repents for the Judicatum that he just referenced, and he says that he was under the influence of Satan in writing it. And he attempts to bind, I go over this in my Pine Sap debate, which I probably will also react to. He literally attempts to bind the universal church on faith and morals, and he admits he commits an error in trying to do so. And then 2 years later, he repents and submits to the council. So I go over this, I go over a bit of this, but I don't mention the part where he literally says he was under the influence of Satan when he was writing the document he was just citing.
Even after removing Pope Vigilius, the same session still goes out of its way to mention that it is still united to the Apostolic See, saying, and I quote, "Let us preserve unity to the Apostolic See of the most holy Church of ancient Rome, carrying out all things according to the tenor of what has been said." So the Pope finally ended up ratifying Constantinople II anyway, after being under house arrest in Constantinople for 9 years. Even after the Pope accepted the council, he did so by his own authority, not in submission to it. He condemned the 3 chapters again without mentioning the council, and his approval of the council was expressed in 2 documents, a letter to Eutychius of Constantinople on December 8th, 553, and a second constitutum on February 23rd of 554. When the council was ratified by the Pope, his excommunication was removed, and it is not part of the official acts of the council. This famous historical episode leaves no question about it. Even a Roman emperor who had all of the Eastern patriarchs in his back pocket knew that not only is the Pope above a council, but the Pope is necessary for a council to even be binding on the universal church. The 6th century also gives us another example of the Pope being supreme over regional synods, even those in the East, because towards the end of this century, Pope Pelagius II annulled an entire Eastern Synod. This is according to Pope Pelagius II's successor, Pope St. Gregory the Great, who wrote this. He said, 8 years ago, in the time of my predecessor of holy memory, Pelagius, our brother and fellow Bishop John in the city of Constantinople, seeking occasion from another cause, held a synod in which he attempted to call himself universal bishop, which as soon as my said predecessor knew, he dispatched letters annulling by the authority of the holy apostle Peter the acts of the said synod, of which letters I have taken care to send copies to your holiness. So Pope St. Gregory the Great threatened to do the same thing and annul the Eastern Synod of Constantinople for the same reason that the Patriarch was again trying to adopt the title of universal bishop. Orthodox scholar Edward Syczenski says in page 192 of his book, The Papacy and the Orthodox, Sources and History of the Debate, and I quote, Gregory thus provides a modern ecumenical discussion on the papacy with a two-edged sword. For on one hand, there is no doubt that he defended the primacy of Rome vigorously and grounded his preeminence on his see's Petrine origin rather than on any conciliar decision. The Protestant historian Philip Schaff also says that Pope Gregory had authority over the Eastern churches.
So real quick, just so I wasn't able to put it in the comments because it's too long. However, I just put this over on Twitter. I put it in the comments of my live stream here. And it's the two things that are often contested about this. So it's first him blaming the enemy of the human race, that's Satan, for writing the first document that he wrote regarding the 3 chapters. So this is his repentance 2 years later. And then the second thing is his excommunication at the council for those that say that he was not excommunicated. It's very clear that the council did indeed excommunicate him. So those are two things that are often contested. Here's the citations. You guys can go look at that if you are interested. I want to make sure you guys have the receipts.
In his work, History of the Christian Church, on page 224. The 7th century is also jam-packed with instances of papal supremacy. Orthodox saints like Pope Theodore and Pope Martin exercised universal jurisdiction. I will be reading from Michael Lofton's book, Answering Orthodoxy, starting on page 138, where he says this.
By the way, I found out after, like, this Lofton having me on to do this debate may have just been a promo for his book. I mean, he unintentionally launched my apologetics, in orthodoxy, my apologetics career, if you will. But that was his original intent, I think, and it kind of backfired.
The evidence shows that the Pope was more than a first among equals in the case of Pope St. Martin I, venerated as a saint in Orthodoxy, who in the 7th century intervened in the affairs of the territories of Antioch and Jerusalem during the Monothelite crisis. The Anglican convert to Catholicism, Thomas William Allies, describes the situation by saying this. About the year 650, Pope St. Martin exercises his power of universal jurisdiction by constituting John, Bishop of Philadelphia, his vicar in the East, that you may correct the things which are wanting and appoint bishops, presbyters, and deacons in every city of those which are subject to the see, both of Jerusalem and of Antioch. We charge you to do this in every way in virtue of the apostolic authority which was given to us by the Lord in the person of the most holy Peter, Prince of the Apostles, on account of the necessities of our time and the pressure of the nations. The kind of intervention in the affairs in an Eastern jurisdiction is also seen in Martin's predecessor, Pope St. Theodore I, who is also venerated as a saint in Orthodoxy, who commissioned the Eastern Bishop Stephen of Dort to depose heretical bishops in the Patriarchate of Jerusalem. And Stephen of Dort at the same council says that only the Pope can stop the Monothelite heresy because the Roman See rules and presides over all others, and says that it has always had the authority to do such a thing because of the divine promise of Christ to St. Peter, according to Father Richard Price in his Acts of the Lateran Council. And Orthodox Saint Maximus the Confessor also says this, affirming papal supremacy but I see everybody on the screen, so I think that my time is up. Is that good?
You got 20 seconds.
Okay, so I'll just read what St. Maximus says here. He says, let him hasten before all things to satisfy the Roman see, for if it is satisfied, he will agree in calling him pious and orthodox. He's only wasting words who thinks he must convince of lure such people as myself instead of satisfying the Pope. And I had a whole bunch more to go, but like I said,
you can finish the quote. You can finish the quote, man. I mean, like,
okay. Well, if you agree to it, Luigi.
Yeah. I mean, and how much more time do you got, bro? Because if you got like just a couple minutes, you're good to finish.
If it's okay with Michael, I only got like 2 minutes.
That's fine as long as Luigi's okay with that.
As long as it's not like 10 minutes, you go ahead, bro.
No,
if you
it's
got
like
a couple minutes
like,
left, you're good.
That's up to you then. Okay.
Yeah, if you got a couple minutes left, you're good.
It's like 2 or 3 minutes. Is that cool?
Go for it.
Okay, cool. So let me finish. Let me see really quick. All right. In the Sixth Ecumenical Council.
All right, I own this one. I'm sorry, guys. I allowed him to keep going. Oh, I was trying to be nice. I was trying to be, like a gentleman, trying to treat this professionally, things like that. But, here we go.
Constantinople III took place, and it is explicit in making the claims that are echoed by Vatican I, namely papal infallibility. According to Orthodox Saint Pope Agatho, who was at the council, Constantinople III's resolution had already been previously defined by Pope Barn I. This is in Pope St. Agatho's letter to the emperor, which was read out loud in the council. This is another example of the Pope being supreme and definitively and authoritatively settling doctrinal matters apart from a council. The council famously condemned a previous Pope, Honorius, as having been a private heretic. At first glance, this might seem like an instance of a council being above a pope, but it actually isn't. The council is only authoritative because Pope Agatho ratified it. If the council had condemned Pope Honorius, but Pope Agatho had not ratified it, the condemnation would have been null and void. This is actually an example of another Catholic teaching related to papal supremacy, which is that a pope can only be judged by a future pope. This is exactly what we see in the case of Pope Honorius, who was judged by a future pope in St. Agatho, and he just so happened to do this in the context of an ecumenical council. In the next century, Orthodox Saint Pope Sergius demonstrated papal supremacy by rejecting the Eastern Synod of Trullo in 692. The rejection continued into the 8th century as Pope John VII had also rejected it after having been sent the canons of Trullo for approval, which he never gave. And he was believed to have been supreme over canons of Eastern councils, even by the emperor, according to Liber Pontificalis, that says that the emperor sent him the acts of the councils and he didn't say anything about them. And one last thing, they were finally ratified by Pope Constantine, who finally accepted the canons of Trullo, with some exceptions and only binding them on the eastern part of the church, which is called the Compromise of Nicomedia. So the emperor had to ask 3 different popes before one would finally accept them. And when they were finally accepted, it was only for the East. They weren't universal. So once again, this shows that papal supremacy over Eastern synods is also something that we see in the first millennium.
That's also not really true, because the council is often cited, both East and West, as an extension of Constantinople III. So it's just not true that it wasn't binding on the West. They like to say that because it's so blatantly anti-Western. It allows priests to be married, and it accepts particular local councils that they reject, and it also reinforces Canon 28 of Chalcedon, which they also don't like. So that's why they have to backtrack on it. They do this all the time, where they'll accept the council and then they'll backtrack on it because they realize how problematic it is for their paradigm.
And that the Pope's disciplinary decrees can only be changed by a future Pope. This is the teaching of Vatican I, and I'll just leave it there. Thank you for that.
All right, thank you. And Luigi, you can also go over your time extra if you need to as well to make it fair for you. So that's perfectly
no worries.
fine.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll set it for 25, but hey, if you, like I said, if you need more than that, that's fine. Okay.
Hang on 1 second.
I'll pop in about 1 minute before just to kind of give you a warning.
Okay, one moment here. I'm just going to
heads up, I should say.
All right, we made it. You guys made it through the most brutal part of the debate. Now it gets fun. I promise you that my opening statement is fun and it's engaging. and it's not just an info blast. You guys can actually listen to the arguments follow, and then it gets really fun as we get into the rebuttals. So congrats, you made it through the worst part, and now here we go.
I just want to say, brother, phenomenal presentation. Phenomenal.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Whenever you're ready, you give me the go, and then I'll start.
Is the Vatican I papacy the true supreme authority of the Church? There is a reason the Roman Catholics place so much emphasis on this question. Because if they can prove the Vatican I version of the papacy, then they have proven that they are the one true Church. I want to begin by establishing the burden of proof that my brother Alex must carry today. Many Roman Catholics will point to examples in the first millennium of the obvious primacy of Rome as if this is evidence for their position. However, the primacy of Rome is virtually uncontested among Eastern Orthodox and even Protestant scholars. Alex's burden of proof today is much heavier than simply the primacy of Rome. Rather, he has to prove that the Pope was treated as an autocrat with infallible capabilities, as Pastor Eterno states, quote, "Therefore, faithfully adhering to the tradition received from the beginning of the Christian religion, we teach and define that it is a divinely revealed dogma that the Roman pontiff, when he speaks ex cathedra, enjoys through the divine assistance that infallibility promised to him in the blessed Peter, and therefore that the definitions of the same Roman pontiff are irreformable of themselves and not from the consent of the Church," end quote. Two things I must highlight from this passage. First and foremost, the claim is that this has been the teaching since, quote, the beginning of the Christian religion, end quote. Secondly, that his authority is, quote, not from the consent of the Church, end quote. This is further captured in the Vatican's official interpretation of Pastor Eternos by Bishop Gasser, quote, "If these words of Christ are to have their necessary force, then it seems to me that one should conclude that the brothers, that is, the bishops, in order that they be firm in the faith, need the aid and advice of Peter and his successors, not vice versa," end quote. And again, quote, "It can be in no way deduced that there is a strict and absolute necessity of seeking that consent from the Church or from the bishops," end quote. I want to directly contrast this with the ancient apostolic canon 34, which states, quote, "The bishops of every nation must acknowledge him who is first among them and account him as their head, and do nothing of consequence without his consent. But neither let him who is first do anything without the consent of all, for so there will be unanimity," end quote. Instead of finding the definition of Vatican I, in which the Pope can speak without the consent of the episcopate, we find the opposite. Rome in the first millennium was the first see. No one disputes this. Alex will likely bring to your attention example after example where Rome is appealed to in the first millennium, and you will find no contest from me regarding this. However, remember, his burden of proof is not to demonstrate that Rome was the head of the Church.
I just put in the comments a link to part of my thread on the papacy where I actually have even more quotes than what I just read that reinforce this, because they really try to say they go for this papal minimalism nonsense, and they try to contest what I just said about their burden of proof. I just posted in the comments a link that has even more quotes that are binding upon them that make it very clear that that is truly their burden of proof.
But rather to demonstrate what Vatican I dogmatically claims, that the Bishop of Rome has the authority to decree without the consent of the Church, and this has been the teaching from the beginning. I've already read the ancient apostolic canon 34, which states the literal inverse of this, quote, "But neither let him who is first do anything without the consent of all." Yet again, this is stated in canon 9 of the Council of Antioch in 341, quote, "But let him undertake nothing further without the bishop of the metropolis, neither the latter without the consent of the others." To further demonstrate this point is the Council of Sardica in 343, accepted by both the East and the West. The Council states in canons 3, 4, 5, and 9 that when appeals are made to Rome, the case will simply be reviewed by Rome, but the final appeal is heard by neighboring bishops in a synod without the Pope even present. Instead, he was authorized only to send legates. This means that in every example of appeals to Rome that Alex will inevitably bring up, the matter was settled in a council with the consent of the Church. Which leads me now to the historical examples. Surely we will find that papal supremacy, regardless of the consent of the Church, has been evident since the beginning of Christianity, as Vatican I asserts. Or will we instead see, as prescribed in the ancient canons, a conciliar model of which Rome is the head and he acts as the ratifier of the bishop's decisions? I first want to point out that not one of the 7 ecumenical councils was called by the Pope, despite the fact that Vatican II states, quote, "It is the prerogative of the Roman pontiff to convene councils, preside over them, and confirm them," end quote. Lateran 649 was the only attempt by a pope to call an ecumenical council, and this is not held to be an ecumenical council by the Orthodox Church, nor by any magisterial source within the Catholic Church. Ask yourself, why was yet another ecumenical council required after a pope had already produced his decree via a papal encyclical, and had even held a previous council of which he had attempted to declare ecumenical? If the teachings of Vatican I were truly known from the beginning of Christianity, this would have been all that was required. Instead, the heresy of monothelitism did not meet its formal anathema until declared such in the Council of Constantinople III of 681. This council is often used by Roman Catholics to support the papacy. In fact, most of their arguments ironically involve a council. The argument from Roman Catholics is typically that the letter of Pope Agatho is read as an infallible autocrat's orders in this council, to the extent that he has several ex-cathedra statements in the letter. This would be a good argument if the council didn't repeatedly refer to the letter in Session 8 as, quote, suggestions, or in the Latin, suggestio, and in the Greek, anaphora, end quote. Now, one might say this was just their manner of speaking, to which I respond with several quotes from the council themselves. In their letter back to Pope Agatho, the council states their own definition is infallible, quote, "And we all agree, both in heart and tongue, and have put forth, by the assistance of the life-giving Spirit, a definition, clean from error, certain and infallible, not removing the ancient landmarks, but remaining steadfast in the testimonies and authority of the holy and approved fathers," end quote. The only infallible declaration recognized by the bishops was that of the council collectively consenting to. The closest thing to one's individual infallibility during this council is not the Pope, but rather the Emperor, when Pope Agatho declares, quote, "For these decrees, the Holy Spirit, by his grace, dictated to the tongue of the imperial pen," end quote. My next argument regarding this council is in reference to the condemnation of Pope Honorius, anathematized as a heretic. Now, we can argue, as scholars have for centuries, whether or not he was guilty of monothelitism, or if this was simply a private error. But my argument transcends this question. If the Pope is above a council and no one can judge a Pope except another Pope, as affirmed throughout Denzinger, Vatican I, and Vatican II, why did the Third Council of Constantinople feel perfectly comfortable with condemning a Pope as a heretic? I thought these teachings have been known for all ages and have been understood since the beginning of the Christian faith. Did the bishops of Constantinople III miss the memo, or could it be that a conciliar model held in modern Eastern Orthodoxy was always the model taught by the Church? The famous passage of Matthew 16 is used time and time again to try to prove the papacy, and we will address this in further detail later on. However, I want to point out how this passage is used in Constantinople III in the final acclamation of the council. They state this, quote, "And with the Almighty who rules with you, O most devout emperor, you decide because you are appointed by God. Rejoice, O city of Zion, summit of the world and the empire. Constantine ornamented you with purple and crowned you with faith. And the gates of hell shall not prevail against your Orthodox empire," end quote. So the concluding proclamation of the council not only states that the emperor is appointed by God and has the final decision, but also that the gates of hell shall not prevail against Constantine's Orthodox empire. The very fact that Matthew 16...
Okay, I got to clarify something. Someone said that Ben is a Mets fan. That has to be referring to Cleve because, first of all, I don't really watch baseball, and I definitely wouldn't be a Mets fan if I did. My sports is mainly like football. I'm a diehard Packer fan. I love the Packers. So, yeah, that's like pretty much like the only sport I care about. Is my goy slop, that's my goy ball that I can't resist just because I was born and raised watching the Packers. But so just to clarify for those that are worried that I'm a Mets fan, that's totally not true.
Is used by an ecumenical council to affirm to someone other than the Pope provides serious consideration in other instances where Matthew 16 is used in councils. If Matthew 16 is simply about Peter and his successors in Rome, then we would never expect it to be used for any other context. However, if we interpret, quote, "the gates of hell will not prevail against it," end quote, to mean the orthodoxy of Peter will not be overcome by the gates of hell, then this quote from the Sixth Ecumenical Council makes perfect sense as to why it's not applied to the Pope. Notice the language in the quote. the gates of hell shall not prevail against your Orthodox empire. It is not Peter and his successors in Rome who alone have the protection against the gates of hell, but rather it is the Orthodox theology of Peter and the other apostles that is preserved in the church. This means that whenever language is used to suggest that Peter is speaking through the Pope, the most consistent interpretation of this is that the Pope is simply upholding the theology of Peter. If a Pope fails to do this, Peter is no longer speaking through him, which we will now see clearly in the Fifth Ecumenical Council held in Constantinople in the year 553. This council contains the most unequivocal attempt by a pope to make what is now known as an ex cathedra statement. The focal point to the council was a controversy of the three chapters. Now, there's a lot of historical background of these chapters that is irrelevant to this debate, but for now, all you need to know is that they contain Nestorian tendencies. The council was called by Emperor Justinian, and despite Pope Vigilius' attempts to host the council in the West, it was held in Constantinople. 2 years after Pope Vigilius issued what was called his Judicatium, which moderately condemned the three chapters, he withdrew it. This was the watershed event that triggered the convening of the council. Pope Vigilius refused to attend the council due to lack of representation from the West, despite the fact that there was equal representation from each patriarch's jurisdiction. During the council, Pope Vigilius wrote his final decree to the bishops in attendance, titled the Constitutum. This document refused to condemn the authors of the three chapters as heretics. In this document, his final assertion was as follows, quote, "We ordain and decree that it be permitted to no one to write or bring forward anything contradictory to the contents of this Constitutum, or, after this declaration, begin a new controversy about them. And if anything has already been done in contradiction to this our ordinance, thus we declare void by the authority of the Apostolic See," end quote. A couple things I want to highlight from this quote. Pope Vigilius concludes his letter by asserting his ultimate authority as the Apostolic See. He says that following this letter, there is to be no new controversy regarding the three chapters. It is the final declaration to which no one should question, by the authority of the Apostolic See. The Constitutum meets all the requirements of an ex cathedra statement. It is an unequivocal and unambiguous attempt to assert his supreme authority over the council. Surely, since this supreme authority has been recognized since the beginning days of Christianity, as Vatican I asserts, the council would receive this letter as the final authority and the council would be concluded, right? Unfortunately for papal apologists, this was not the reaction of the council. In their response back to Pope Vigilius, they state the following, quote, "And to this end, we brought to his remembrance the great examples left us by the apostles and the traditions of the fathers. For although the grace of the Holy Spirit abounded in each one of the apostles, so that no one of them needed the counsel of another in the execution of his work, yet they were not willing to define the question then raised until being gathered together, they had confirmed their own several sayings by the testimony of the divine scriptures. But also the holy fathers, who from time to time have met in four holy councils, disposed of by a fixed decree the heresies and questions which had sprung up. That by common discussion, when the matter in dispute was presented by each side, the light of truth expels the darkness of falsehood, nor is there any other way in which truth can be made manifest when there are discussions concerning the faith, since each one needs the help of his neighbor. As we read in Proverbs of Solomon, a brother helping his brother shall be exalted like a walled city, and he shall be strong as a well-founded kingdom. And again in Ecclesiastes, he says, two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their labor. So also the Lord himself says, verily I say unto you, that if two of you shall agree upon the earth as touching anything they shall seek for, they shall have it from the Father who is in heaven. For wheresoever two or three are gathered in my name, there I am in their midst. End quote. They then go on to condemn the authors of the three chapters as heretics, despite Pope Vigilius' Constitutum attempting to maintain them as saints. So to be blatantly clear, the Pope attempts to institute his authority over the council as the See of Rome, and the council's response is to reject this authority by referencing Matthew 18 and multiple other passages that support a conciliar model. Not so coincidentally, Matthew 18 is the same passage where the keys of Matthew 16 of binding and loosing are given to all 12 apostles. One final point in this final declaration of the council. Notice they do not single out any one apostle when stating that the, quote, grace of the Holy Spirit abounded in each one of the apostles. so that no one of them needed the counsel of another in the execution of his work, end quote. This is the Vatican I view of infallibility. And yet here it is being applied to every single apostle, and Peter is not mentioned. Not only this, but the declaration points out that despite the Holy Spirit being present as a guide in each apostle, they did not make a formal decision on the circumcision of the Gentiles until meeting in a synod. So even if one were to grant the infallibility of the Pope, this would refute the idea that he does not need the consent of the church. Even the apostles needed the consent of the church. Surely, so does the Pope. Less than a year later, Pope Vigilius then retracts this constitutum, replaces it with yet another constitutum. In this final document, he concurs with the council's decisions to condemn the authors of the 3 chapters as heretics, which begs the question, which constitutum is infallible if both meet the requirements of an ex cathedra statement? Later on, when this council is then summarized in the session 1 of the 7th Ecumenical Council, it states, quote, when the Holy and Ecumenical 5th Council had assembled at Constantinople, a common and universal anathema was imposed on Origen and Theodore and the teaching of Agredius and Didymus on preexistence and a universal restoration in the presence and with the approval of the 4 patriarchs, end quote. According to the 7th Ecumenical Council, over 200 years later, this council was seen as fully valid with the affirmation of the 4 patriarchs of Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. One of the best summaries of the ecclesiology of the first millennium is a quotation by St. Theodore.
I'm not gonna lie, I forgot about that quote. That's a fire quote. The fact that Nicaea 2 says that is significant for those of you that understand the ins and outs of this debate. That's a crazy quote. I totally forgot about that one. And somebody asked who is the best apologist we have on this matter. I would say it's a tie between Ubi and Craig. Ubi's got excellent articles on it, and then Craig has Rise and Fall of the Papacy, which is the best book on this topic.
Theodore the Studite that reads, we are, quote, we are not discussing worldly affairs. The right to judge them rests with the emperor and the secular tribunal. But here it is a question of divine and heavenly decisions. And those are reserved only to him to whom the word of God has said, whatsoever you shall bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatsoever you shall loose on earth shall be loose in heaven. And who are the men to whom this order was given? The apostles and their successors. And who are their successors? He who occupies the throne of Rome and is the first, the one who sits upon the throne of Constantinople and is the second, after them those of Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. That is the pentarchic authority in the church. It is to them that all decisions belong in divine dogmas. The emperor and his secular authority have the duty to aid them and confirm them what they have decided, end quote. There are many more examples throughout history I could address, but for now I'll be moving on to the Holy Scriptures before my concluding remarks. I believe the strongest argument is to be found in Matthew 16 itself. On this passage hinges the entirety of the papacy. Now, Alex and I could play church father quote ping pong regarding the interpretation of this passage until the cows come home. Or I could reference a Roman Catholic scholar who compiled every single citation regarding the rock of Matthew 16. Let me read from his findings. Quote, the French Roman Catholic Lanoy surveyed the patristic evidence, found 17 citations supporting the concept that Peter is the rock of Matthew 16. Please note, this does not mean that all 17 of these fathers also felt this meant that the Bishop of Rome is his sole successor, but only that they felt they saw Matthew 16 in the phrase, this rock.
I just put in the comments, the link to my thread that refutes this clown in the comments saying, oh, the Russian church is not in communion with, et cetera, et cetera. And that question actually gets brought up at the end, and I answer it kind of insufficiently because I was an inquirer. I didn't understand ecclesiology at the time, but I did put my thread in the comments that directly addresses that objection, and it's total nonsense. For those of you that are interested,
as referring to Peter. However, Lanoy found 16 citations that identify the rock as Christ. He found 8 that identified all the apostles together as forming the rock of Matthew 16, and he found 44 indicating that the rock of Matthew 16 was the confession of faith made by Peter in Christ Jesus, end quote. Now, my argument here is not that Peter isn't the rock. I believe he is. However, the consensus of the fathers is that Peter's profession of faith is far more important thing being established here. He was the first to speak, and in this context was the first of the disciples to acknowledge the divinity of Christ. Because of his faith, he is rewarded with the keys of the kingdom, the authority to bind and to loose. However, Matthew doesn't end with this passage. In fact, less than 2 chapters later, Jesus gives the guidance on how to resolve conflict in the church, starting in, quote, verse 15, quote, "If your brother sins, go and show him his fault in private. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. But if he does not listen to you, take 1 or 2 more with you, so that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every fact may be confirmed. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. Again I say to you, that if 2 of you agree on earth about anything that may ask, it shall be done for them by my Father who is in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I am there in their midst." End quote. The verbiage Jesus uses here regarding the authority to bind and to loose is identical to what he just told Peter in chapter 16. This authority in Matthew 18, however, is given to all 12 apostles, and more importantly, given to the church. Remember, this was the same passage referenced by the Fifth Ecumenical Council when they were justifying the authority of the council above that of even the Roman pontiff. This is why Pope Leo, along with dozens of other church fathers who express a similar view, states, quote, "Whatsoever you shall bind on earth, it shall have been bound in heaven, and whatsoever you shall loose on earth shall be loose in heaven." This power is confided to him in a special manner, because the type or forma of Peter is proposed to all the pastors of the church. Therefore, the privilege of Peter dwells wherever judgment is given with his equity. End quote. In other words, what Pope Leo is saying here is not that Peter is a super bishop who passes his infallible authority exclusively to the See of Rome, but rather that Peter is the prototype for what every bishop represents. Both St. Clement and St. Ignatius reinforce this point when they state that every bishop is the high priest. St. Ignatius was a disciple of the Apostle John and was appointed in his see of Antioch by St. Peter. St. Clement was both a disciple of and appointed by St. Peter. Surely, if anyone understood the ecclesiology of St. Peter was leaving to his successors, it was the 2 of these first-generation fathers. St. Ignatius states, quote, "See that you all follow the bishop, even as Jesus Christ does the Father, and this presbyter as you would the apostles, and the reverence of the deacons, as being the institution of God. Let no man do anything connected with the church without the bishop. Let that be deemed a proper Eucharist, which is administered either by the bishop or by one to whom he has entrusted it. Wherever the bishop shall appear, there is the Catholic Church." This is in chapter 8 of his letter to the Smyrnaeans of St. Ignatius. St. Ignatius is clear here that the bishop is there, the Catholic Church, and most importantly, the Eucharist. The Catholic Catechism states, quote, "Sunday Eucharist is the foundation and confirmation of all Christian practice."
Just broke 160 for, I think, the first time. I don't know if you guys realize how insane this kind of viewership is, given that I literally just launched. So thank you for making this possible. Let's obviously keep it going. Please keep liking the live. I sent the super chat link. It's pinned down there. If you guys want to send me a super chat to support, I try to do this without ads. I want to do my show without ads. I really want to. And so I appreciate the support. But yeah, thank you guys for the viewership. This is awesome.
End quote. At the Second Vatican Council, it states, quote, "These Eastern churches, although separated from us, possess true sacraments. Above all, apostolic succession, the priesthood, and the Eucharist." End quote. If the Eastern Church have the Eucharist, this means they have Christ, which begs the question that St. Ignatius answers here. If you have the Eucharist and you have the bishop, what are you missing? St. Ignatius believes you are missing nothing. Because St. Peter is the prototype for the bishop, and he passes his authority to the bishop, the diocese then becomes the temple. St. Clement drives this point home even further when he states, quote, "Let us preserve in the church the order appointed by God. Those, therefore, who present their offerings at the appointed times are accepted and blessed, for inasmuch as they follow the laws of the Lord, they sin not. For his own peculiar services are assigned to the high priest, and their own proper place is prescribed to the priests." End quote. chapter 40 of his epistle to the Corinthians. Again, we see the same structure to which St. Clement is stating as appointed by God, that the bishop acts as the high priest and the presbyter as the priest. Once we begin to understand how these early fathers understood apostolic ecclesiology of St. Peter as the prototype for the episcopacy, the other pieces fall into place. Such an example is the lines of succession that were non-apostolic, such as Jerusalem. These lines of succession almost always begin with Peter as the first to ordain them. These bishops then do not succeed him as an infallible autocrat, but rather as the high priest that he fulfills in Matthew 16. This is why St. Cyprian states, quote, "Our Lord, whose precepts and admonitions we ought to observe, describing the honor of a bishop and the order of his church, speaks in the gospel and says to Peter, I say unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Thence, through the changes of times and successions, the ordering of bishops and the plan of the church flow onwards, so that the church is founded upon the bishops, and every act of the church is controlled by these same rulers. Since this, then, is founded on the divine law, I marvel that some will, daring temerity, have chosen to write me as if they wrote in the name of the church, when the church is established in the bishop and the clergy and all who stand steadfast in the faith. End quote. To conclude, I again assert that it is the burden of proof of Alex to demonstrate the Vatican I definition of papal supremacy was understood and abided by in the ancient church. This is clearly defined in Vatican I when it states, quote, "This has been understood since the beginning of the Christian religion," end quote. Yet also again, I state that Vatican I's definition of papal supremacy is authority above councils. And he does not even require the consent of the church in his decrees. This is evident in Vatican I when it states the Roman pontiff's decrees are, quote, "irreformable of themselves and not from the consent of the church," end quote. This objectively contradicts the model of the early church. Their model was conciliar, synodal, and no one superbishop could ever supersede this authority, despite their many attempts to do so. I will end my statement the same way the great fathers of the faith did in the Fifth Ecumenical Council, with a verse from Matthew 18, quote, "For where two or three have gathered together in my name, I am there in their midst," end quote.
So that last point I just nailed home is like super important, where I read where it says in Vatican I that this has been known since the beginning of the Christian religion, that the Pope has this authority that can supersede ecumenical councils immediately and without the consent of the church. This is their burden of proof. Once again, I had linked earlier. I'll probably relink it so you guys can see. This is their burden of proof that they try to run from, but it's very important we hold their feet to the fire on it, because this is what their council claims. And this is what the extrapolation from Gasser also claims as the official interpreter of Vatican I. So they try to run from it, and we got to make sure that they can't.
All right. Thank you for that. So you had 1 minute left. Do you want to add anything? That's it. Okay. No problem. All right. Let me start the clock or reset the clock here. We're going to go into our rebuttal period. And now we have 10 minutes apiece, beginning with Alex. Alex, you let me know whenever to begin the timer, and then you can have it. You're on mute.
Now I'm good to go. Now I'm ready.
Okay. All right. Let me know when to hit it.
All right, go for it. Luigi, that was an excellent opening statement, my friend. You did a fantastic job. Oh, you see my producer meddling with me. So you mentioned a lot of things. Let me go through all of them really quick and respond to as many of them as I can. I'm just going to kind of go backwards here. You said that the early church was conciliar. Well, I demonstrated how in the first 2 centuries of the church, you have examples. With example, Pope St. Clement, who you yourself quoted, where Pope St. Clement went into the territory of Corinth by sending them a letter, and that he was able to settle a schism that was going on in that church, and he did it without the need of a council. Same thing happened with Pope St. Victor, who he actually was able to call a synod in the East authoritatively, threatened to excommunicate an entire region of the church in Asia Minor, and nobody said that he couldn't do it, and nobody threatened him with excommunication. So we have two early examples from people that knew the apostles, popes that knew the apostles. In the case of Saint Clement, that he was able to do that in a territory that was not his. Now, you mentioned Saint Cyprian as well, and you quoted something that Saint Cyprian said, and it's important to note that Saint Cyprian's ecclesiology toward the end of his life doesn't match the Catholic or the Orthodox ecclesiology, because Saint Cyprian believed that pretty much every individual bishop was, in a sense, sovereign, which actually isn't what the Orthodox Church teaches, because in Saint Cyprian's writings, you have no sense whatsoever of a metropolitan bishop or even a
This is just not true. Cyprian still acknowledged these other hierarchies. It's just that he saw every bishop as Peter, which again, like, this is actually granted in the modern Roman Catholic paradigm. They grant to an extent that every bishop is Peter. In fact, they even grant that every apostle and every successor received the keys. So this is something I don't point out in this this debate. So let me find it. I'm going to keep playing it, and then I'm going to show you guys. But let me find it first.
Patriarchal bishop. Saint Cyprian, toward the end of his life, believed that all bishops were technically, what's the word that I'm looking for? That they were all sovereign, and that what they said goes, and that no other bishops could ever interfere.
So this is Lateran IV. It's ecumenical for the Roman Catholic. Nobody can affect this sacrament except a priest who has been properly ordained according to the church's keys. Keys. The church's keys. That's the keys of Matthew 16, which Jesus Christ himself gave to the apostles and their successors. Whoa. And if they say it's not the keys of Matthew 16, ask them which other keys Jesus gave to the apostles and successors. What other passage is there that says that Christ gave the keys to somebody else? Show another passage. This is their ecumenical council. So whenever they bring up Matthew 16 or Ma keys, you just show them Lateran IV, where it literally says every apostle and every successor has the keys. I'll link this in the chat.
Fear, which isn't what we see in history. But I wanted to quote this from Saint Cyprian. He says this about the Pope, quoting the famous passage, the Lord says to Peter, I say to you, you are Peter, on this rock I'll build my church. On him Peter builds the church, and to him he gives the command to feed the sheep. And although he assigns a like power to all of the apostles, yet he founded a single chair, cathedra, and he established by his own authority a source and an intrinsic reason for that unity. Indeed, the others that also which Peter was, the apostles, but the primacy is given to Peter, whereby it is made clear that there is but one church and one chair. So too, all of the apostles are shepherds, and the flock is shown to be one, fed by all of the apostles in single-minded accord. If someone does not hold fast.
So we grant this, and in fact, in Craig's book, if you read Craig's book, he particularly points out that especially in the first couple hundred years, like, Rome was a unifying see, but other sees also were, like Jerusalem. Like St Augustine says that in order to be Catholic, you have to be in communion with Jerusalem. Emperor Justin, in fact, the Formula Formistas was actually really embarrassing for the Roman pontiff, because Emperor Justin demands that the Pope edit it so that Jerusalem will accept it. And I go over all this in my Pine Sap debate, which, like I said, I'll probably it's sort of like a sequel to this one. So I'll probably react to that one as well. But yeah, I mean, the other sees were also, unifying sees, but we would say that, like, that is something that we would attribute to Rome, especially in these first couple hundred years.
To the unity of Peter, can he imagine that he still holds the faith? If he should desert the chair of Peter upon whom the church is built, can he still be confident that he is in the church? So there, St. Cyprian says that there is only one chair for the entire universal church, which is again a position that he would later went on to. He changed his position, but that position that he changed to isn't held by the Orthodox ecclesiology either.
No, he didn't change his position. It's so okay. I'm really glad that he just made this argument. So there's honorifics of the Pope, and oftentimes Roman Catholics, they will cite Saint Cyprian or they'll cite Emperor Saint Justinian, who have quotes prior to controversies that are honorific to the Roman Pontiff. But then when a real life example happens, in practice, it's not what they claim it is. So in other words, it literally proves, it doesn't prove that they switched their position. That's nonsense. They didn't switch their position. They were just giving Rome these honorifics. And the same exact thing happens with Emperor St. Justinian, who is the same emperor who then throws Vigilius in jail and demands that he submit to the council. So, and if I could summarize the difference in the two arguments between the Roman Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox on one point, it's this. Roman Catholics are reliant for their arguments on quotes. Eastern Orthodox are reliant on actual case studies. So they will quote mine these quotes that are super honorific, and I have a thread that refutes this because honorifics were given to every see, and I'll put this in the comments. But when it came to when the rubber actually meets the road with both Cyprian and St. Justinian, what ends up happening? It doesn't play out like Vatican I. Not even close. So it's not that he switched his position. It's that he, Voice of Reason and other Roman Catholics are misunderstanding the purpose of what St. Cyprian is saying. And then when it's actually in practice, St. Cyprian is employing Orthodox ecclesiology. And the same thing happens with St. Justinian.
You also mentioned that, so you mentioned something interesting, that the sacraments, right, that the Catholic Church accepts the sacraments of the Eastern Orthodox, which is true. The Catholic Church accepts the sacraments of the Eastern Orthodox, which is in line with what we read with the early church fathers, like you mentioned, St. Ignatius of Antioch. But here's the thing. Many of the Eastern Orthodox don't accept the sacraments of the Catholic Church or the Oriental Orthodox Church or the Assyrian Church of the East. So if you were to compare both communions, the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, the Catholic Church is actually more in line with what was taught by St. Ignatius than what the Orthodox Church would be. The Orthodox Church would have to come up with some reason as to why all of a sudden the popes in 1054 from one day to the next no longer had valid.
This is a nonsensical point. What are you talking about? You guys don't have apostolic succession anymore. Because apostolic succession, as is the testimony of the fathers, requires not only the formal ordination, but also continuity of doctrine. So what are you talking about? You don't have a valid episcopacy.
Sacraments. So that's the burden of proof is actually on the Orthodox, not on Catholics. Catholics are perfectly consistent on that point. You also mentioned that St. Ignatius also says that every bishop is the high priest. That's true. Every single bishop.
I want to show you guys this on this point too. So because this is a huge problem for Roman Catholics in by affirming that we have a valid Eucharist. So this is 1 Corinthians chapter 10. St. Paul says, "Is not the cup of blessing which we bless a sharing in the blood of Christ? Is not the bread which we break a sharing in the body of Christ?" This is the Eucharist. He's talking about the Eucharist. "Since there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. Look at the nation Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices share in the altar?" So what St. Paul is saying here is that the reason why the church is one, the unifying factor, is not a dude in Rome, it's the Eucharist. That's why the church is one. So if you affirm a Eucharist outside the church, you got a big problem because that's incompatible with this verse. There can't be a Eucharist outside the church. There is only one Eucharist because the Eucharist is the sacrament of unity, as St. Augustine says. It's what defines our unity. So no, this is not a problem for Orthodox. We reject you having a Eucharist because you don't have a valid episcopacy. We're perfectly in alignment with St. Ignatius. So that's another argument you guys can use on the Roman Catholics. That's 1 Corinthians 10, verses 16 through 18.
Is the high priest of his territory, of his diocese. And Luigi, you know that the church is structured in a particular way. At the most local level, you have a group of priests, and one of those priests is the high priest, who we call the bishop at the most local level. But then we also know that we have other territories, other dioceses that are all together in a province. And in one province, all of the bishops that share one province, one of those bishops will be called the metropolitan bishop or the archbishop, and he is the head of that province. And then when you have a whole bunch of provinces that are together in a territory, one of those metropolitan bishops or archbishops is called the patriarch, right? Well, if you just take it a step further, if you have multiple patriarchs in the world, if one priest is ahead of others in a diocese, and that's the bishop, if one bishop is ahead of the others in a synod of bishops, and that's the metropolitan or the archbishop, and one metropolitan is ahead of the other metropolitans in an entire territory, and that's the patriarch, that would mean that one patriarch would be ahead of the other patriarchs in universally speaking, and that is the...
So this is, to an extent, this is actually true. This is what Ubi argues for. He basically says that similar to how the patriarch has authority over the archbishop, the Pope has authority over the other patriarchs. That is actually, to an extent, true because they're the first see. But what doesn't follow is that see can never fall away, or that it can transcend the consent of the church, because neither of those things are true for any of the other ones that went before it. Patriarch, archbishop, metropolitan, bishop, whatever. Neither of those two things are true, and that's their burden of proof. So their burden of proof is not that they have authority over the other patriarchs. We grant that. Their burden of proof is to prove they will never fall away. They cannot fall into heresy. They will never fall away. The see will never be empty. And that they can supersede the ecumenical consent of the rest of the church. That's their burden of proof.
Patriarch of Rome, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. So we agree completely with St. Ignatius' ecclesiology. You also said that Peter's confession of faith is the rock, and you agree that Peter is the rock, but you said that 44 fathers in the early church claimed that it was St. Peter's faith that was the rock. I'd like to point you to the Catechism of the Catholic Church. This is paragraph 424. A lot of people don't know this, but that idea that St. Peter's confession is the rock, that is part of Catholic teaching. The Catholic Church affirms that. This is what 424 says in the Catechism. Moved by the grace of the Holy Spirit and drawn by the Father, we believe in Jesus and confess, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. On the rock of this faith confessed by St. Peter, Christ built his church. So that's actually a definitive, authoritative interpretation of Matthew 16 as well. It's Peter who is the rock because of his faith. What this means, saying that it's Peter's faith that is the rock, is that Peter's faith, what he believes, what he professes, that's what's infallible. And that's...
Yeah, I would say that the genuine Orthodox and the genuine, not genuine Orthodox Church, but like the genuine teaching of the Orthodox Church and the genuine teaching of the Roman Catholic Church, I would say actually they're pretty much the same position. And so I would say he's right about this. I was merely just showing like the patristic witness that, look, like the emphasis is on his profession of faith. We don't deny that Peter is the rock, but the emphasis in the fathers is not on Peter, but on his profession of faith. That's all my point was. I would agree with him, though, there is a big... this is a point of agreement with us.
It's a key distinction. It's a more precise way of talking about the Pope's infallibility, because we don't believe that the Pope is infallible in everything that he says. We don't even believe that the Pope is impeccable in his behavior. We believe that the Pope is only infallible in matters of faith. And that's what it means when it says that Peter's faith is the rock. It's a much more specific way of explaining why Peter himself is the rock. It's specifically his faith. So that doesn't contradict Catholic ecclesiology either. You also mentioned the Pentarchic authority, the Pentarchy being the 5 patriarchs, that they had to do everything together. I know that you quoted, you gave some quotes that says that the pentarchy always has to be united, always has to have, that nothing can be done without the pentarchy as a whole. However, if that is the case, and that is the truth from the very beginning, all the way from the time that the church was established, we would have to reject the Council of Ephesus, because the Patriarch of Antioch, the entire Church of Antioch, rejected Ephesus. We would have to reject the next council, the Council of Chalcedon, because the Patriarch of...
So no, this is not how that works. So if an individual patriarch is in error and you have the universal consent of all the other patriarchs, you can depose and replace, if necessary, another patriarch. This has always been the model, where in order to depose and replace a patriarch, you have to have the consent of the rest of the patriarchs. So like at Chalcedon, they had the universal consent of the other 4 patriarchs to depose and replace Dioscorus. That's how it works. So he's wrong about this. That is universal consent. That is how the church has always operated. And Craig walks through this in Rise and Fall of the Papacy.
Alexandria, the entire Church of Alexandria, rejected that council as well. So we don't have perfect pentarchic agreement even on ecumenical councils. And those councils we still hold to be authoritative, even though we had entire patriarchates that rejected them. And the reason they were authoritative is, once again, because they were ratified by the Bishop of Rome. Now, he talks about the burden of proof that I have. I think that I've defended the thesis well in my opening statement. The burden of proof that Luigi would have is...
So notice he doesn't contest the burden of proof. A lot of Roman Catholics after this, because they realize how difficult this burden of proof is to carry, they try to contest it. And I have sufficiently refuted that with my Twitter threads that are very clear. You couldn't possibly be more clear. This is their burden of proof. Superseding councils against the consent of the church. That's the authority of the Pope. He concedes that. He concedes that in this debate. He thinks he met that. He wasn't even close to meeting that.
He would have to, for example, one way that he could win this debate is if he were to just name one ecumenical council that wasn't ratified by the Pope, or one ecumenical council that was able to...
No, I wouldn't need to do that. That's not the burden of proof I would need, because a Pope is a valid patriarch. So now, in order to, if the See of Rome is empty, like it is now, then they're not a valid patriarch, and so we don't need their ratification. But if there is a valid Pope, of course we need their ratification, just like we need every other patriarch. Unless they're being deposed, excommunicated, like we need the ratification of the Pope. We agree with this.
Reject something that the Pope had already definitively taught. The one thing that makes all of the 7 ecumenical councils, the one thing that makes them unique, that makes them ecumenical, apart from all of the other regional synods and robber councils, isn't that they were convoked by the emperor, because we have other synods. We have at least 2 that I can think of out the top of my head that were convoked by the emperor, who the emperor wanted them to be ecumenical councils, and they're not ecumenical councils in the Catholic or the Orthodox churches, simply because the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, did not ratify them as such. And man, you brought up so many great points. The Council of Sardica, if you read canons 7 and 8 of Sardica, 7 and 8 of Sardica say that whatever the Bishop of Rome says, or whatever his definitive, what's the word that I'm looking for? Whatever the Bishop of Rome decrees cannot be contested by any bishop or any synod of bishops at all. So that's what the Council of Sardica says, Canon 7 and 8. And again, I think that's my time. That went by super quick. You said so many great points, my friend, but I couldn't get to them all. But that was as much as I could do.
We'll get plenty of time on the cross exam, bro.
Oh,
I'm not gonna hit everything either. So
awesome, brother.
All right. Let me go ahead and start the timer over. Whenever you're ready, Luigi, let me know.
All right. So he also made a lot of really good points. I'm going to try to hit as many of these as I can. So he opened with a quote by Father Richard Price from in regards to the Tome of Leo at Chalcedon. So I want to read another quote by Father Price at Chalcedon. He says, quote, "Nothing could be more indicative of the mood of this council than the fact that even Theodoret had to defend the Tome of Leo by appealing to the authority of Cyril. His own attitude was by far more critical. He had strongly attacked Cyril's 12 chapters back in the pamphlet war in early 431 and had been reluctant to accept Nestorius' subsequent condemnation. But he clearly recognized that it would be disastrous to argue that there was something valuable in the tome of Leo that was lacking in Cyril. Instead, he played along with the conviction of the majority that Cyril provided the yardstick of orthodoxy. He says, again, same council, again, Father Price, quote, "The followers of Chalcedon were profuse in their professions of loyalty to Cyril, even when judging the tome of Pope Leo. Their criterion of orthodoxy remained."
This language is very, very important. Judging the tome of Leo. Wait a minute. I thought no one can judge a pope except for a later pope. So why is this council, the audacity of this council, to judge the tome of Leo, which modern Roman Catholics cite as being ex cathedra, an ex cathedra statement, and it's being judged according to this Catholic priest, this scholar, who is literally the gold standard for these councils? Hello? The Pope is being judged? Interesting.
Agreement with Cyril. This is clear throughout the lengthy discussion of the tome in the fourth session. I'm going to move on to a couple of historical examples that he brought up. He brought up Corinth's appeal to Rome. I would simply ask, why does Clement writing to Corinth prove Petrine supremacy any more than Paul writing to Corinth proves Pauline supremacy? So that would be my first question. I would also say he brought up the Apostle John. There is debate over whether or not the Apostle John was in exile at the time. However, the fact that that Rome was appealed to by Corinth instead of John is actually irrelevant. Rome had appellate authority, and eventually so did many patriarchates. Corinth is well within Rome's jurisdiction. I know you had said it's not, so we're going to have to maybe talk through that, because they actually had legates representing ecumenical councils that...
Yeah, and again, this is in Craig's book where he goes over the jurisdictions, and Corinth was within Rome's jurisdiction, so it was under their patriarchate.
Or from Corinth, so it's definitely well within their jurisdiction. You brought up a quote from Irenaeus, which, like you said, St. Irenaeus, and in that quote, it says that both Peter and Paul make Rome unique. When Vatican I specifically says it's the see of Peter, I will also say with St. Irenaeus, is he... there's a quote in Against Heresies where he talks about the lines of succession from the apostolic sees having more authority than the other sees. And so St. Irenaeus understood that there was this early doctrine of apostolic sees having more authority than just like a normal see. And actually, you see the same thing in St. Cyprian. And so this is why he actually has quotes that say that St. Stephen had some authority over him. It was because St. Stephen came from an apostolic see and St. Cyprian did not. In regards to Victor's excommunication, Eusebius writes this in his ecclesiastical history, quote, "Among them too, Irenaeus, writing in the name of the Christians, whose leader he was in Gaul, though he recommends that the mystery of the Lord's resurrection be observed only on the Lord's day, yet nevertheless, Irenaeus exhorts Victor suitably and at length not to excommunicate the whole churches of God for following a tradition of an ancient custom. And he conferred by letter that this mooted question, not only with Victor, but also with all the other rulers of the church," end quote. So we see, again, a conciliar model. There actually were synods in regards to the excommunication over this particular issue. There were multiple synods prior. I know when you mentioned the synods, you were talking about the adoptionists. We can talk about that too. Irenaeus additionally asserts regarding a pope previous to Victor, I think it was the pope right before Victor, on the same controversy. He says, quote, "Pope Anticetus conceded to Polycarp in the church the celebration of the Eucharist by way of showing him respect," end quote. So I would simply ask
So, that's pretty crazy, right? That a pope is submitting to a see. Like, this is a very early pope in the first couple centuries of the church, and is submitting to St. Polycarp of Smyrna because he was an apostolic. This shows the reverence that everybody had for apostolic sees early on. And since St. Polycarp was a direct disciple of St. John, the Pope had that amount of reverence to submit to him.
How can you reconcile a pope conceding to a non-pope, another bishop, another apostolic bishop? How can you justify a pope conceding to him when brought up with the same issue? Arian controversy. I mean, the Arian controversy is an extremely complicated situation. Obviously, St. Athanasius was in hiding, so that is why he had to appeal to Rome. I don't know that
St. Athanasius appeals to St. Constantine before he appeals to anyone. That's the first person he appeals to. This is in Craig goes over this. So he was St. Athanasius appealed to like everybody. And then the only person that helped him was the Pope. So that, I mean, because the whole church was cooked. Except for, well, for a brief period, so was Rome. Rome also, now it was under coercion, but still Rome signed a Arian confession. So Rome was not without error during this time either. But it just so happened that the Pope did come to St. Athanasius' rescue, but he appealed to everyone. He literally was appealing to everyone.
Appealing to Rome is really a problem for my argument at all, though. I would say that the fact that St. Athanasius was appealing to Rome for support when he was in hiding, when there was hundreds and hundreds, maybe even thousands of Arian bishops in the East, that's not really a problem for an Orthodox point of view. The fact that he was appealing to a see that was maintaining orthodoxy. I already brought up, you brought the Council of Sardica. I don't have any issue with the Council of Sardica. I think the Council of Sardica actually refutes the Vatican I view of the papacy. Like I said in my statement, there would first be a sentence by the neighboring bishops. Then if the deposed bishop feels the sentence was unfair, he may appeal to the Bishop of Rome because he's the first see. However, as we see in Canon 3 and 9, he is just a review court. If he determines that a retrial is necessary, the final decision for the case is sent to a neighboring province, and the Bishop of Rome is not even authorized to attend. As far as you brought up Ephesus 449, which is a really good point that you bring up, I would say that there were multiple local synods in both Alexandria and Rome that had declared that Nestorius was a heretic prior to the Pope's decree. I would also say that St. Cyril felt completely comfortable with his 5 tomes against Nestorius being distributed throughout the churches. And so his condemnation of Nestorius was being circled throughout all of Christendom, and he had no issue with that. And then I have some quotations from Ephesus, but we'll see if I can come back to those in my time. Main point is the councils that were held before the Pope's final decree by the letter of St. Celestine. All right, this is a super important point. I really need everybody to pay attention very closely to this. He used a lot of quotations, really good quotations that show this absolute language of the Pope being the successor of Peter, and Peter speaking through the Pope, and the Pope will never fail. I really need to nail this point in the absolute language that's used in these councils. Listen to this quote. This is by Father Richard Price. It says, "Nor does my devotion suppose that any of the most devout bishops are aware that not merely once or twice, even more frequently, on the matter for the instructions from the divine and inviolable head, I informed everyone that all of the most devout bishops should meet together and hold a common inquiry into the precisions of the pious and Orthodox faith." The inviolable head they're talking about is not the Pope. It's the emperor. In this context, it's the emperor. So you have the emperor is being called inviolable, unable to err. We see the same thing with the quotation I read earlier, with the use of Matthew chapter 16 being used for the emperor, saying that, "And with the Almighty who rules with you, O most..."
After this debate, there was like this Ibarra and Lofton. By the way, Ibarra basically said I won this debate. I can maybe find that that screenshot. But there was like this big, they were like saying inviolable doesn't mean can never err. There's other quotes that also say the emperor can't err. In fact, let me find those so that I can give them to you guys. I want to make sure I show my work.
So vote emperor. You decide because you are appointed by God. Rejoice, O city of Zion, summit of the world and the empire. Constantine ornamented you with purple and crowned you with faith, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against your Orthodox empire. The early fathers were not anticipating that the empire would ever fail. They were not anticipating that any of this stuff would fail. They were anticipating that this would maintain in its same structure until the end. So if you're going to hold absolute language to be interpreted literally, you have to believe that somehow the empire of Constantine The emperor is still ruling today. That's what you'd have to believe. Ephesus 449 you talked about. Ephesus 449 is a blatant robber synod. I mean, the Patriarch of Constantinople was murdered during this council. And yes, of course, the papal legates fled and stated that they rejected the council. The reason why this is not an ecumenical council is because it was not affirmed by the patriarchs, including the Pope. And then Dioscorus, you mentioned Dioscorus. He was deposed at Chalcedon and replaced with a true patriarch. So Chalcedon did have the approval and the affirmation of all 5 patriarchs, which is the definition of an ecumenical council, as we see in Nicaea too. You brought up the libellus of Hormisdas. We'll see how much time I have here. I'm just going to read. Patriarch John II of Constantinople says, quote, "I accept the fact that the 2 most holy churches, that is to say, that of ancient Rome and of New Rome, should be one. I admit that the See of Peter and that of the imperial city should be one." So he's uniting Constantinople with Rome here. He was the only patriarch to sign off on this, and it was with imperial influence, was the only reason why he signed off on the libellus. And none of the other patriarchs signed off on it. You mentioned bishops. None of the other patriarchs signed off on it. There is some contest in regards to the Greek of the libellus, which I can read from Edward Denny's book in a little minute. It looks like I have 60 seconds left, I think.
Correct.
Okay. Just trying to figure out what to focus on here. Yeah. So Constantinople too, you had mentioned, or rather Constantinople III, and with Honorius, I would just ask, I know some Roman Catholics take the position that Honorius was not actually a heretic. Some say he was. So I would just ask which pope was correct. I know we're going to hash a lot of this stuff out in the cross exam.
I just put it in the comments where Pope Leo literally says that the emperor cannot fall into error. So for those of you that want that quote, I posted the link to where I posted it.
Trullo. I'm going to finish on this. You mentioned Trullo was not accepted by multiple popes. That's fine. It was accepted by Pope Hadrian in Nicaea II. It was read in its entirety and affirmed by the council at Nicaea II. In an ecumenical council, a pope affirmed it.
All right. So now we are going to move on to the next part of the debate, which is going to be the cross-examination period. So Alex, you're going to begin 25 minutes of cross-examining Luigi. And, y'all can be pretty flexible here, though, but just traditionally, the format would be Alex, you would ask questions, then you would respond to them. Traditionally, the person responding doesn't ask questions, they just respond. But I allow for some flexibility if y'all want that, if y'all want to do that. Okay, so I got the timer here set for 25 minutes. Alex, if you are ready to begin questioning Luigi, I'm ready to roll.
All right, let's do it. Let's begin. Okay, so Luigi, you said that Nicaea II when Pope Hadrian accepted the Council of Trullo. Was Pope Hadrian the first pope to accept the Council of Trullo?
I don't know that that's relevant because it was read in its entirety and affirmed by the Pope in an ecumenical council. And so just the fact that it was in an ecumenical council makes it therefore more authoritative than just a Pope accepting it or not accepting it. So I would say that's not relevant.
And did the Council of Nicaea II accept Trullo as being an ecumenical universal council for all?
I'm not necessarily making that argument. I'm saying the council was read in its entirety and then affirmed. They said we find no error with this council. So it was read in its entirety and then affirmed by Nicaea II.
Right. Are you aware that Pope Constantine, long before Pope Hadrian, actually accepted Trullo, and he said that it only applied to the Church of the East and that it's not universal? Are you aware of that?
Yeah. I mean, again, I don't think that has any relevance to the fact. It doesn't refute the fact that it was affirmed by Nicaea II in an ecumenical council. I don't think that refutes that.
But you're also aware that before Pope Constantine accepted it, 2 previous popes, John VII and the pope before him, they rejected the Council of Trullo, and all of the churches in the East, they respected that that authority of the Pope, that he rejected the councils because they weren't considered authoritative until after Pope Constantine accepted them. You're aware of that, correct?
Yeah, yes, but again, this does no relevance. There's much dispute over what councils are accepted and what not accepted. But when an ecumenical council affirmed by a pope affirms a council, that means the council is authoritative. This is why you, as a Roman Catholic, accept Chalcedon, or not Chalcedon, Carthage, 397, for example. And so, just because there's dispute over whether or not a local council is authoritative, doesn't matter if an ecumenical council reads it in its entirety and affirms it.
Yeah, this is so true. So like they will try to like glean from councils. And like it's just not how it works. They try to do this with Constantinople 879 too. They try to do this with the Council of Constance, with Haec Sancta. They just like they're like, okay, yeah, we accept like these parts of the like hundreds of years later, they'll be like, okay, we accept these parts of the councils, but not these other parts. It's totally post hoc and ambiguous, and usually not reflected by the early popes that accept them.
Is the Pope above councils, or I'm sorry, is the Pope above canons, or are canons above the Pope?
I would reject that dichotomy. I would say that the conciliar consensus of the church in an ecumenical council is above the Pope.
That's not what I asked. I asked, are canons above the Pope?
Ecumenical canons?
Canons at all, yeah.
I mean, it has to be an ecumenical canon affirmed by the five patriarchs.
It can only be an ecumenical canon affirmed by the five patriarchs. Okay. Why do we consider Ephesus to be ecumenical when we had a patriarchate that didn't accept Ephesus?
All the patriarchs accepted Ephesus. All the valid patriarchs eventually did accept Ephesus. That's the point.
Ephesus was ratified as an ecumenical council apart from the Church of Antioch, and everybody accepted that, but Antioch didn't accept it. The same thing is true for the Council of Chalcedon. There was a patriarch there that didn't accept it. So
yeah, like I already explained, when you have the universal consent of the rest of the patriarchs, you can depose / replace / excommunicate another patriarch. This is standard Orthodox ecclesiology.
When you say that Nicaea II says that all the patriarchates need to accept a council, does that apply for all time from the very beginning, or is that just a canonical law that isn't definitive? It isn't something that is part of a divine constitution of the church. It's just something that they said to go forward, because we know that it's not true with the early ecumenical councils.
No, again, the valid patriarchs did affirm the council. Again, with Chalcedon, for example, Dioscorus was deposed at Ephesus, and the Egyptian bishops were actually the ones who brought forth the true a true patriarch that did affirm the council. So you would have to argue. I mean, first, I would say that that's not true about Ephesus and Chalcedon, and then on second, I would say you would have to disagree with the definition of an ecumenical council that Nicaea II gives. You have to say that Nicaea II is wrong about its definition of an ecumenical council.
Okay, you talked a lot about a lot of the language that was used about the Roman emperor. You don't affirm Caesaropapism, do you?
I mean, define it.
Caesaropapism basically means that the emperor, the Roman emperor, is the one who calls all of the shots in Jesus Christ Church.
Oh, I would affirm I love the quote by Theodore the Studite. I mean, when he says that the emperor is there to aid as the final acclamation, and that's really what we see in Constantinople III, when actually Pope Agatho himself says, that was Pope Agatho who says the Holy Spirit was guiding you by his authority with the imperial pen when he's speaking to the emperor. So Pope Hadrian understood, or Pope Agatho understood this, and the bishops of Constantinople II and III understood this. So that's what my view would be on that.
So what happened in the 4th century when the Roman emperor was an Arian, and he deposed all of the Orthodox bishops and put in Arian bishops? Was the Roman emperor infallible then, like as the quotes have said, as the quotes that you've brought up have said about him?
Yeah. I'm not arguing that the emperor is infallible. I'm arguing that they were using absolute language, and it's not to be taken literally. I mean, Pope Felix II was an Arian as well. And so there are examples of falling into error.
Who they venerated as a martyr for literally like 1,500 years. And then now they consider him to be an anti-pope. Felix II was literally venerated in the Roman Catholic Church formally for 1,500 years, and then now he's considered an Arian heretic, anti-pope. I'll see if I can dig up the receipts for that.
This does not refute the overarching testimony of these councils that the final acclamation of the ecumenical council by the emperor and by the patriarchs and by the pope is what makes it authoritative, and that is infallible.
Did Pope Felix II teach Arianism in his magisterium?
That's irrelevant. I mean, did the emperor teach Arianism in his magisterium? Like, I mean, this is like the point.
Go ahead.
I feel like you might be attacking a straw man because I'm not arguing that. Like,
okay, then let's move on to let's move on to something else. Then, what does it mean that the Pope is merely the first among equals?
Yeah, so I would say that this would be akin to the Nasi in the Old Testament. That's where we see the continuity, where it was still held in the Sanhedrin, but there was a head of that Sanhedrin. What we see in the Byzantine two-headed eagle is the emperor and the pope, and we see both of these affirming the ecumenical council, and that along with the patriarchs then makes it ecumenical. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay, I'm going to read you a quote from an Orthodox priest and canonist. He's a scholar. His name is Father John H. Erickson. I'm going to read you this quote, and I want you to tell me what you make of it. He says this: "While the Patriarch of Constantinople is acknowledged by all as first among equals, what this priority involves in the actual life of the Orthodox churches is by no means clear." So what do you make of that quote?
The Patriarch of Constantinople being the first?
It says, yeah, the Patriarch.
You're talking about like second millennium when Rome schismed, and is that what the context of this is, or like what?
It would have to be, because it says the Patriarch of Constantinople is acknowledged as the first among equals, which the Orthodox today acknowledge him as that. But it says here that is not clear. This scholar in Canada is saying that it's not clear what that even means.
Sure.
For example, can the Patriarch of Constantinople make other churches autocephalous?
Well, actually, that actually happens in Ephesus 431. Churches are granted autocephalous at that council.
But I said the Patriarch of Constantinople by himself. Just what do you make of that quote?
No, we would never say that. We would say that it always is to be. I mean, we would affirm what Sardica does, that the first see operates as the first among equals, but always in the model of a synod. Always.
So canonically speaking, the mother of a church can grant autocephalous to that church. It doesn't have to be an ecumenical council. It was for Ephesus with Cyprus, but there's cases where a patriarch that is not the first see can grant autocephaly. That is the canonical practice. And it's if they're the mother church, if they're the one that planted that church, then they have the right to grant them autocephaly, even without a synod.
Is with left and right lateral accountabilities.
If the Pope is
without a universal synod, so like they might have a local synod, and because the patriarchate has to agree to it, which is not just the patriarch, the synodal patriarchate or the patriarchal synod needs to affirm it. So that's kind of what I'm talking about with those checks and balances.
If the Pope doesn't have universal jurisdiction, how did Pope St. Victor excommunicate Theodotus of Byzantium by his own authority apart from the Bishop of Byzantium?
Yeah, was this, you're talking about the issue of the Asia Minor? With Asia Minor?
This was actually before that. This was something else.
Yeah, so I would say this, right? I mean, I already read to you the Pope right before before Pope Victor. He actually concedes to Polycarp's authority. And so I would say that in those really early days, the apostolic sees were perceived as having more authority. The sees of, for example, when Stephen has authority over Cyprian early on in those early quotes that Roman Catholics.
He's like moving his mouth. You guys see this? Like while I'm talking, he was moving his mouth. I wonder here.
Authority over Cyprian early Stalin with Asia Minor.
This was actually before.
I wonder if
this was something else.
Is he listening to something?
So
is he
I would
talking to
say
somebody
this, right?
on mute?
I mean, I already read.
Didn't notice
the
that
Pope
the
right
first time
before
around.
before Pope Victor. He actually concedes to Polycarp. Polycarp's authority. And so I would say that in those really early days, the apostolic sees they were perceived as having more authority. The sees of, for example, when Stephen has authority over Cyprian early on, in those early quotes that Roman Catholics love to use of St. Cyprian, what he's referencing is the apostolic authority of Stephen. That it also is found with St. Polycarp, which is why Pope Anicetus recognizes that authority.
Yeah, and like I said, the other thing too is a pope does have the right to cut off, like, unilaterally, without their own, without a universal synod, they can cut off someone from their own communion. That's not an issue for us.
So I do think that you would find, it doesn't shock me that in those early days you would find the apostolic sees operating in that sense. I think. Well, I'll save that for my cross exam.
And that would also apply to St. Victor being able to call a synod in Asia Minor by his own authority?
So now are you talking about the Quartodecimans, or are you still talking about the adoptions?
Yeah. He called the synod in Asia Minor, according to Eusebius, that he called it by his own authority.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the Quartodeciman issue, again, I read the quotation from Eusebius, in regards to St. Irenaeus, when he exhorts him, and then he says that he wrote to all of the rulers of the church, including Victor. And so I would say you still find in that scenario a conciliar model.
I want to read to you
another fun fact, because he mentioned the Pope like calling that synod. When it came to universal ecumenical councils, every single one of the ecumenical councils was called by the emperor, not the Pope. Every single ecumenical council was called by the emperor, without a single exception, until they changed this model in the second millennium and the Pope started calling his own ecumenical councils.
I'm going to read to you two canons from Sardica, and I want you to tell me what you think. Canon 4 says this: if a bishop is sentenced with deposition in a case by a verdict of those bishops who have sees in neighboring places, and if the deposed bishop announces that his case is to be examined by the city of Rome, then the execution of the sentence is suspended, and that a replacement bishop shall not be ordained to the see of the deposed bishop until after the case has been determined in the judgment of the Bishop of Rome. That's Canon 4. Canon 7 says this: if a bishop is deposed from his office by bishops of his region acting as a court, and if the deposed bishop takes refuge with the Bishop of Rome and seeks recourse by asking the Bishop of Rome for a retrial, and if the Bishop of Rome decides that the case should be retried, then the Bishop of Rome may write to those bishops of a neighboring province to investigate conduct a retrial. The deposed bishop may ask the Bishop of Rome to delegate priests to the retrial. At his discretion, the Bishop of Rome can send priests acting as legates with his authority to serve as judges in cases where the Bishop of Rome decides that the bishops of a neighboring province alone are insufficient. What do you make of those two canons?
Yeah, so what's happening here is a bishop who is deposed is appealing first to their neighboring bishops. If he doesn't like the decision of those neighboring bishops, he then can appeal to the first see, which is how the first see operates. Now, the Pope then, as the first see, analyzes the situation, and if he determines that a retrial is authorized, is necessary, then he sends that actual retrial, the actual appeal, then goes to another neighboring province, and he then is able to send legates, but he doesn't even attend that. So the final appeal is made in a council, it's made in a synod.
Just dropped in the chat where Latin fathers are agreeing with me. In fact, St. Augustine goes as far as to say, if a bishop is deemed guilty by Rome, that he can still appeal to a universal council to transcend Rome's authority. So St. Augustine is literally saying that if Rome is wrong about its decision on the bishop, that bishop can appeal to the Universal Council. He's saying the Universal Council is above the Pope, is above Rome. It's in my link that I just sent into the chat.
Canon 9 says that it's sent to the court for the final declaration.
And that final declaration, that final decision, cannot be overturned by any singular bishop or a synod of bishops or councils. Correct?
I don't know if I'm comfortable saying that.
Well, let me read.
I didn't know about the St. Augustine quote at this time, where St. Augustine literally said, I mean, it's so explicit. Like, here, I can just read it. This is, like I said, I sent the link there in the chat. He says this: well, let us suppose that those bishops who decided the case at Rome were not good judges. There still remains a plenary council of the universal church, in which these judges themselves might be put on their defense, so that if they were convicted by mistake, their decisions might be reversed. This is literally St. Augustine. He's explicitly saying the exact opposite of what Vora is saying right here, that it's a final decision. I mean, this could not be possibly more clear. What St. Augustine's ecclesiology is explicitly orthodox.
Look, let me read some quotes from you, because I actually read these in the opening statement. This is from Pope St. Boniface, where he says, we have directed to the Synod of Corinth such writings that all brethren may know there is to be no review of our judgment. In fact, it has never been licit to deliberate again on that which has once been decided by the Apostolic See. And he also says, writing to the Eastern bishops of Thessalonica, it is certain that the Roman Church is, as it were, like the head of its members, for the church is spread throughout the whole world, and if anyone cuts himself off from her, he is exiled from the Christian religion, since he no longer can share in the same fellowship. So in the first quote, he is saying that the decisions of Rome cannot be appealed, cannot be overturned, that's it, that's where the buck stops. And then he says that if you depart from this, that you're no longer part of the Christian religion. What do you mean?
Actually, to my boy Nick in the comments, I did read, I was just ignoring you. But no, everybody go subscribe to my boy Fearless Truth down there, Nick, one of my best friends, and he crushes it cooking Muslims over on TikTok and his YouTube. And also, he's the one who literally helped me get set up. All this setup, my background, everything, my main screen too, all this stuff is I forgot to unpin that comment. Is all because of him. So thank you, Nick, my dear Orthodox brother.
Make of that?
Yeah.
And one other quick thing, he says that no one has ever boldly raised his hands against the apostolic eminence, from whose judgments it is not permissible to dissent. No one has rebelled against this who did not wish judgment to be passed upon him. And this was accepted by all of the other churches. What do you say about that?
Yeah. So I think it's easy to read quotes like that and kind of get an idea that was the model of the early church. But what I would contrast that with is the Meletian schism, where Rome was on the wrong side. And it wasn't until, in fact, they were the only ones that weren't in communion with the church. After Constantinople won in 381, the bishop that they had appointed, Paulinius, was not recognized as the true bishop, the true patriarch of Antioch. Instead, it was St. Flavian, who was recognized as the true bishop of Antioch. And so the council decides, then Alexandria submits to the council's decision. Rome attempts to override this. And I can actually, if you'll let me, I can read their response back to it. This is in the synodical letter of Constantinople I. This is their response to Rome trying to assert this authority. It says, although with one voice of consent and respect, the bishops of the province and of the eastern diocese have met together and canonically ordained this reverend and most religious Flavian as bishop over the most ancient and truly apostolic church in Syria, where the first noble name Christian was given. This rightful ordination was received the sanction of the general council. So again, the bishop of Rome tries to appoint his own bishop in Antioch, who's Paulinius. The council says, no, it's Flavian. And this was their response when Rome tries to assert that authority. It wasn't until several years later that Rome finally submits to the rest of the church. They were out of communion with the true patriarch of Antioch, but Antioch was still in communion with the true church. So this idea that you have to be in communion with Rome to be in communion with the true church is not found in history. It contradicts history.
If the Pope doesn't have universal jurisdiction, how is Pope St. Martin, how is he able to replace nearly the entire patriarchates of both Antioch and Jerusalem?
Okay. This one, I'll just be honest, I was not prepared for this one. So my answer is insufficient, but I'm going to find you guys. There's this case study that he's about to go over, actually disproves the Roman Catholic paradigm. And I'll show you guys the quotes. But going into this, just know that my response was not sufficient.
Jerusalem by his own authority.
You're talking about after the Lateran Council?
Yeah, Pope St. Martin was able to send delegates into Antioch and Jerusalem, and he replaced pretty much both of those patriarchates.
Mm-hmm.
All
Yeah,
by
I mean,
himself.
I guess I don't understand why Roman Catholics bring up a Lateran in the first place, because this was attempted to be ecumenical by the Pope. But yeah, I mean, I would just say that's him operating as the first see. I'm not disputing a level of appellate authority here.
So what I said is not like wrong, but he misrepresents the situation. So in this same link that I just sent that has the St. Augustine quote, it also has a quote from Pope St. Martin. So yes, Pope St. Martin was helped because the Patriarch of Jerusalem was empty and they needed help appointing bishops. He did appoint bishops, but he explicitly says here that he doesn't have the authority to appoint a patriarch. So this is Pope St. Martin speaking. He, Stephen of Dora, was ordered to ordain bishops and priests and deacons according to the canons, as far as power was lacking to us to appoint the Patriarch of Jerusalem. So he admits, Pope St. Martin admits he doesn't have the authority to appoint a patriarch. But in the modern Roman Catholic paradigm, and they did this throughout in the second millennium, they unilaterally appoint patriarchs. But here, Pope St. Martin is explicitly saying that he doesn't have that authority. And I cooked Pine Sap on this in my debate with him.
By the first see, then you would agree that he has the authority to do what Pope St. Martin did then.
I mean, just out of a little bit of ignorance on exactly what that situation was, I'd say yes. But I would say again that Lateran 649 is a really hard one for a papal apologist, because this was tried to be made.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. Like what I'm saying there is true, but this was technically a separate incident from Lateran 649. But yeah, I mean, what I'm saying is true there, though, that the Pope tried to. This is the one time that the Pope, historians, now the Roman Catholics will be like, oh, he wasn't actually trying to call ecumenical council. Historians universally say this was an attempt at an ecumenical council, and it got laughed off. Like, it got laughed off. Like, people didn't attend it, they didn't recognize it. So the only ecumenical councils that were really recognized were the ones that were called by the emperor.
Ecumenical. And it was rejected as ecumenical by the rest of the church.
So so the answer to that was yes. All I'm going to say is that actually is what Vatican I would teach. That's part of what papal primacy is.
Yeah.
So can the Pope lose his primacy, and if so, who decides that?
Well, hang on. I would just clarify. I would say that's not all that Vatican I claims. So just because that's still not immediate authority over the consent of the church. And that's what you're trying to prove.
So a pope being able to go into the two different patriarchates at the same time and just completely take everyone out and put people back in, that's not universal. That's not immediate jurisdiction.
Well, it is immediate, but it's not immediate over the consent of the church. There was no consent of the church that was trying to dispute this.
Did Pope St. Martin ask for the consent of the church, or?
I mean, not that I'm aware of. I don't know.
So Pope St. Martin believed that he had the authority to do this without having to consult any of the other patriarchs.
Yeah, so the reason I was confused is because he literally was lying. I mean, and I just showed you guys the quote directly from Pope St. Martin. So I was confused here because he's literally lying. Like, once again, like, here is Pope St. Martin literally saying he doesn't have that authority. So this is just a lie. This is just sophistry.
Alexandria or Constantinople?
Does he have the authority to do what?
So Pope St. Martin believed that he had the authority to do this without having to consent with Antioch or Constantinople.
I mean, yeah, again, like, I would say that's him operating as the first see. But that's not all that Vatican I claims. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying that is an operation.
So that's,
I can show you examples of Constantinople being appealed to when they were in a Roman jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. I can show you examples of that. And those were the Patriarch of Constantinople operates without a council in those examples.
Can you show me any canons in the church that say that any other bishop besides the Bishop of Rome can be appealed to, and that decision will be the final authoritative decision?
The Patriarch of Constantinople?
Any bishop besides the Bishop of Rome
Yes, canons
can be
3
appealed
and
to.
canons 9 and 17 of Constantinople 1, canon 3 of Constantinople 1, canon 28 of Chalcedon.
So are you aware that canon 3 of Constantinople 1 was rejected when Constantinople 1 was made ecumenical at the Council of Ephesus, and canon 28 of Chalcedon was rejected by Pope St. Leo?
That is completely false. So there is contest over canon 28 of Chalcedon. Canon 3 of Constantinople 1 was not rejected. I don't know what he's talking about there. That's just a fabrication.
He just outright rejected it, and the Patriarch of Constantinople bowed to Pope St. Leo's authority, and canon 28 was never received in the Christian Church after the Council of Chalcedon.
That's not true.
Even if it was, so even if we granted that that canon 28 was like post hoc rejected, that's fine. Even if we granted that, but this is what the council. I mean, again, like this is the council that they're citing that supposedly affirmed papal supremacy, right? And it literally says that the council of that the Church of Constantinople has equal privileges. They literally have equal. They're called New Rome, and they have equal privileges with Old Rome. That's what the canon states. Equal privileges. So even if you granted that this was rejected post hoc, which is disputed, the point being that the council still affirmed it. This ecumenical council with representation from everybody still accepted it. Now, the Roman legates pushed back a little bit on it, but it still passed in the council. So even if you granted that this was rejected post hoc, which again it shows up in compilations, canonical compilations afterwards. So that's highly contested that it was supposedly rejected. And then canon 3 of Constantinople was definitely not rejected. I don't know what he's talking about there.
The 5th century compilation of the canons, the Prisca Versio, the canons of Chalcedon were compiled, and canon 28 was included. And so actually the fact that Pope Leo attempted to remove it is actually a major disservice to the papal authority, because the church did accept it. In fact, Eusebius, in that very council, states that the Pope had already accepted it in reference to Constantinople 1, canon 3. But I also brought up canons 9 and 17, which bring up the appellate authority of Constantinople. So it wasn't; those were accepted, certainly accepted by everyone.
Yeah, but you are aware that Constantinople 1 wasn't ever considered ecumenical until it was made ecumenical at the Council of Chalcedon. Yeah. So it was considered to be something that was.
This is also false. I'll drop a article by Craig Trulia that refutes this, but it's cited as authoritative by the Universal Church.
Only regional. Chalcedon is what made Constantinople 1.
And even if it was true, it's not an issue, because reception theory there's nothing wrong with reception theory. In fact, they hold the reception theory when it comes to Constantinople 879, which they accepted at the time, and then post hoc went back and said, no, we actually accept 869. That's actually the ecumenical council, not 879. So they agree with reception theory at times. The same thing happens with Constance, with Haec Sancta. So, but then they critique us for reception theory.
Ecumenical. For example, even at the Council of Ephesus didn't recognize Constantinople 1 as having been ecumenical, because when the Council of Ephesus recites the creed, it isn't the creed from Constantinople 1, it's still using the creed from Nicaea 1. So Constantinople 1 wasn't an ecumenical council yet. So those canons weren't universally binding, but at ecumenical councils, those canons, when they were brought up, were rejected by the Pope. Canon 3 and Canon 28 of Chalcedon were both rejected. And again, the emperor, I'm sorry, not the emperor, the Patriarch of Constantinople.
Alex, keep it in the form of a question, though. If you
don't. Are you aware that when Canon 28 was reinserted into the East. It wasn't in ecclesial law, but it was actually inserted in the civil Roman law. I think it's Novella 131. Are you aware that it was never accepted by the church? It was accepted by the civil law.
It was accepted by the church. I mean, again, and actually, I would argue is accepted by the Western church as well, because even at Florence, they refer to the canons that make Constantinople the second see right behind Rome. There's only one canon, singular. There's only one canon. It's Constantinople 1, Canon 3. The only other canon that could be being talked about at Florence is Canon 28 of Chalcedon. So I would actually argue there's a debate to be had whether it was even accepted in the West.
So actually, that canon was accepted before the Council of Florence at the Council of Constantinople IV in 869, and that was finally when the Pope allowed it and allowed the canon after it had been rejected since the very beginning. You are aware of that, right? That Constantinople IV was the first time that Canon 28 was accepted by the Christian Church, not just the civil law of the Roman Empire.
I reject 869 as Constantinople.
Here's the article that where Craig Trullia goes over the evidence for Constantinople I being accepted before Chalcedon. And I dropped the link in the chat.
Constantinople IV is 879.
I didn't ask you if you accepted this council as ecumenical, but I just asked you if you're aware that 869 was the first time that a council that was accepted by Rome was the first time that they affirmed Canon 28 of Chalcedon. You are aware of that?
Well, sure. I mean, that does detriment to the fact that Pope Leo rejected it, but another pope accepts it.
So it only does detriment if the popes are under canon law, but because popes are above canon law, it actually proves.
And there is still not consensus about Canon 28. So like he's saying here that 869 accepts it. A lot of people will say that it's not authoritative. So like, which is it? Like they can't agree on this point on whether Canon 28 was actually accepted or not.
Vatican I, because you would agree then that now in the would you agree that in the first millennia we have instances of popes that rejected canons and then later popes that accepted those canons, such as Canon 28 of Chalcedon and the canons of Trullo? You would agree with that, right?
Yes, but
okay. So
I don't
you would
agree
that the Pope is above canon law.
No. I don't agree that the church was accepting Pope Leo's determination that this wasn't a canon, because again, we find it in the Prisca Versio compilation in the 5th century. So I don't accept that assertion.
But
because the council,
yeah, and even if so, like, let's say so, Leo rejecting it is a sufficient reason for the rest of the church to reject it, because you do need every valid patriarch. Now, if another pope accepts it, that's fine, right? That's reception theory. Again, this is our ecclesiology that they claim to reject, but in practice, they hold to it as well.
Because a council accepts it and a pope accepts it, I think that's detrimental to the papal apologists trying to argue. So was Pope Leo right, or was the Pope of 869 right?
So they were both right, because they both at their times had authority. And you know what? This is my cross-examination. Please ask me that when you ask your question.
Okay.
Yeah. But I'm having so much fun. I hope you're having a good time too. So why hasn't the Orthodox Church been able to hold even a single ecumenical council since the schism, while the Catholic Church has continued to have them?
Well, they just don't call it ecumenical; they call it pan-Orthodox. So in 1672, which is affirmed by all the patriarchs, is considered to be authoritative, and they call it a pan-Orthodox council, not ecumenical. So it's still an authoritative, binding council. So,
which, by the way, we just had one in 1998. Literally more recently than the Roman Catholics have had a universal council. So they claim that we can't call universal councils. We just had one regarding the Patriarch of Bulgaria and his election. And we held a council, we held a universal council in 1998. So, hello, and they claim that we can't call universal councils.
So I would just say that the magisterium itself is slow, but that's because there's checks and balances, just like there was in the first millennium.
Why was it that in the first
Yeah, think about how rare an ecumenical council was called in the first 1,000 years. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of years that go by without a universal council. And then during that time, the patriarchs are basically managing their own patriarchate. That's how we operate today. If Antioch wants to put out something, for their patriarchate, they can do that in a day. But if something needs to be universally binding, you need to have a universal council for it, which happens very rarely, just like it did in the first 1,000 years.
Millennium, they could have a total of 7, but in the last millennium, they were only able to have, according to you, just 1.
Well, because the whole purpose of the ecumenical councils.
No, there's been way more than one. There's the Palamite synods. There's the Council of Jerusalem. There's multiple that have been in regards to various elections of patriarchs. So like there's definitely more than one. And I would say it's just as frequently as the first millennium. I mean in Blackernay as well, was eventually received by the entire church. And, so yeah, there's been way more than one. But they are rare. They're more rare than the Roman Catholic ecumenical councils, which they have them like
was to establish
every
a
other
sealed
decade. It
set of
feels like
dogma.
sometimes.
And so, like, even the very fact that a pope can go in and say that a canon is either invalid or valid of an ecumenical council is actually incredibly dangerous. I mean, at that point, like, I'm always told that a pope can only do that which is tradition has preserved. But you're telling me now that a pope in 869 went in and affirmed a canon of an ecumenical council that was already rejected by a previous pope.
Yeah,
so
this will be the last question that I asked you. Was Canon 28 of Chalcedon, did that have anything to do with matters of dogma, matters of faith or morals?
It specifically uses the word authority.
But did it have anything to do with actually matters of the faith, with like dogmatizing anything or anything having to do with morals?
It says, I was wrong. It says privileges, not authority.
Again, I mean, it's authority gives you authority is a broad term.
The question is simple: does that canon have anything to do with what we read in divine revelation, or with what, or anything that has to do with morals?
Yes, I would say that's what authority means.
What is it that's in divine revelation that Canon 28 of Chalcedon addresses? Where is it in divine revelation, in scripture or tradition, that the see of Constantinople is second place to Rome? Where is that in divine revelation?
Where is that in divine revelation?
Yes, where did God reveal that Constantinople?
But Luigi, you can finish.
I have no idea why that would be a requirement. Actually, this is a great opportunity for me to give this argument, because this is one of my favorite arguments against the Roman Catholic paradigm. So, and I actually used this against Pine Sap. I said, hey, does Rome have its authority because it is Petrine? And of course, he says yes. And then I say, okay, why is it that Constantinople, canonically, at both Constantinople, primarily at Constantinople I, which the Roman Catholics accept, why is it that it's ranked above Alexandria and Antioch, which are both Petrine sees? So Antioch was directly founded by Peter. It's Petrine. The fathers affirm this. Alexandria was Petrine by virtue of St. Mark, who was a disciple of St. Peter, and Pope Gregory the Great explicitly says that those are the three Petrine sees. So if being directly Petrine is what gives you a certain type of authority, why would Constantinople be above Alexandria and Antioch? Shouldn't the Petrine sees be first altogether and then Constantinople? But no, because Constantinople is ranked above the Petrine sees, what it proves is that every bishop is Peter. Every bishop is Peter. So that's why the See of St. Andrew, Constantinople, can rightfully be placed above other Petrine sees, because every see is Petrine in the sense that every bishop is Peter.
Answering the question.
I would. As in divine revelation, I mean, the canon of an ecumenical council being Constantinople I, we find the same thing in the canon of an ecumenical council of Constantinople I. So,
yeah, I don't know why it would need to be in divine revelation. So, and also by his logic, this would mean Antioch. If he's appealing to divine revelation, this would mean Antioch has all, because he's talking about Peter. This would mean Antioch, which was established by Peter, would also have all of the same privileges that he's affirming.
All right. So now, Luigi, you have 25 minutes. Let me know whenever you're ready for me to start the timer. And keep in mind again, we Luigi, you'll do the form of a question. Alex, you'll just respond. You won't pose any questions to Luigi.
Right.
Cool.
Okay.
All right, I'm ready.
Okay.
All right, Alex. So, how do you justify all the ancient canons, such as Antioch, Sardica, and the ancient apostolic canons, such as 34, requiring the consent of the church when binding on matters of faith?
I would say that that's perfectly in line with the post-conciliar church, because of the way that the post-conciliar church, what it teaches about the magisterium, that the Pope isn't the only one that is an organ of the magisterium. All of the bishops that are in communion with the church, they all are organs of the magisterium. So back then, that was before the schism. So all of the bishops were in communion with him. So that is perfectly consistent with what Vatican I and Vatican II teach.
I don't agree. Vatican I specifically says that his authority is irreformable of himself and not from the consent of the church. And then the apostolic canon says he must receive the consent of the church. So which is it?
The apostolic canon says that the Bishop of Rome must concede
The first
consent
see.
of the church.
It says the
first see.
first see must receive the consent of the church. Apostolic canon 34.
Right. Well, you're aware that the apostolic canons actually weren't received in the West, correct?
So you reject. So just to be clear, so you reject the oldest attestation we have of conciliar authority.
So you do realize that the apostolic canons don't come from the apostles themselves, and they were written much later on, around the time of the.
I'm not arguing that they're from the apostles, just like the Apostles' Creed wasn't, but it's apostolic tradition that is preserved in the canons. And so I just want to be clear. So you're rejecting apostolic canon 34 and the Council of Antioch and the Council of Sardica?
I reject them as being universally binding because they were never considered to be universally binding by the church.
Well, Sardica was affirmed by the West,
right? Because because the West called Sardica, right?
Yes, and I mean the apostolic canons are quoted frequently, actually, in other councils. So just to be clear, so you believe that apostolic canon 34 is wrong?
If apostolic canon 34, I wouldn't say that it's wrong. I would just say that it isn't binding universally. It isn't binding on the universal church. It could apply in a sense at a more local level.
Okay.
And I will concede that of the apostolic canons, I believe the first 50 of them were considered to be, because the apostolic canons came from an earlier council. I forget what it's called, but it is authentic, and the first 50 of them were considered to be.
I think somebody whispered, I don't know, based on what we saw earlier, I wonder if someone whispered that in his ear, like, no, you can't reject these, dude. The first 50 are legitimate and accepted by our church. You can't just say they're wrong.
Be authentic. It just doesn't apply at the universal level.
Okay, so now you're saying it's authentic, but you just don't believe that it's binding on a universal level when it's talking about the first see, though. So how can it not be talking about the universal level if it's talking about the first see?
Because the first see didn't accept it. The canon can be about the first see, but the first see didn't accept it.
The first see did accept it. This is what we find in Sardica, which was affirmed by the Pope.
So the first see accepted certain councils of certain canons of the apostolic canons that were in Sardica, but to my knowledge, I don't believe that specific canon is in the Council of Sardica. Or am I wrong?
No. I'm not saying the canon.
Rejecting the canons is worse. It's worse than just trying to reconcile them. I mean, it is a direct contradiction, but like it's way worse to just say, yeah, no, I don't accept these 50. The first 50, which were they were translated into Latin, they were used in canon law. Just to reject them outright is insane.
In itself is, but the concept of the consent being required in a synod, that was what was necessary.
But this is not what Vatican I teaches.
Yes, it is. It's in Canon 3 and 9 of Sardica.
Yeah. So Canon 3. Can we?
We went over this with your. We went over this with your cross exam.
I don't think I quoted Canon 3 though, right? Because I know that Canon 3 actually bolsters the papal claims. But I would say that Canon 3, we can accept all of Sardica because the first see, the Church of Rome, accepted it.
Okay. Well, again, I'd say that the Ancient Apostolic Canon 34 says the same thing. It says that the first see must receive the consent of all. So I'll let the audience make their determination on that.
And there is an Orthodox way to actually be able to understand that. The first see having to receive the consent of all, you could say that fits in with Vatican I because the Pope does represent the entire universal church. So you could say that if the Pope says it, that is the consent of all.
Okay.
That's insane. That's insane what he just said. Oh, that is the consent of all because the Pope speaks for all. That's like when that's like those the surge protectors are like plugged into themselves.
I again say that
the Pope represents the universal church.
We're going in circles, but Vatican I says it's not from the consent of the church, but I'm going to move on.
Right.
Why wasn't Lateran 649 accepted as ecumenical if this is the Pope's intention?
Refresh my memory. Lateran 649 was the council that I know what you're. I have so many councils in my mind. Say it again.
They were trying to address monothelitism as a ecumenical council.
Oh,
and
right.
The Pope attempted to make it ecumenical.
Right. So the council itself wasn't accepted as ecumenical, but the actual teachings condemning the monothelite heresy were considered to be definitive.
No, not until. So first of all, the monothelitism did not meet a formal anathema until 681 at Constantinople III, and Constantinople III doesn't even mention Lateran as even remotely authoritative.
But it actually does mention the Pope who held Lateran 649, saying that he had already definitively settled.
I would need that
monothelite heresy, and I quoted that. I'm gonna see if I can find it again, but I did quote it in my. I think in my opening statement. I'll see if I can find it really quick. But if you want,
I think it is true, but that he's mentioned, the Pope is mentioned. But the point is that the council, which was supposed to be, listen, if a Pope today calls an ecumenical council, that is the universal binding decree. But instead, it wasn't until Constantinople III was called that we get the universal decree. So even if it is mentioned, you don't get the universal anathema of the heresy until the actual ecumenical council is called by the emperor. That's my point.
Move on, feel free. I don't want to eat up your time.
Yeah, I'm going to move on then.
Okay.
What is your justification for why Pope Antecedus concedes to St. Polycarp on the topic of the Quartodecimans? Why would a pope ever concede to another bishop?
Because the Quartodeciman controversy was when he learned that those Christians they were holding to a human apostolic tradition, and he said, "Fine, let it be." And Pope Saint Victor actually did the same thing after initially threatening to excommunicate them because the Pope has that authority.
No. I don't think you. So Asia Minor was operating. There was the Quartodecimans that were operating in the sense that no matter when Nisan 14 fell, that was when they were going to celebrate Easter.
Correct. Right.
And the Pope was opposed to this. I'm not saying that Pope Antecedus was approving of this. He was opposed to this.
Right.
But when Polycarp comes forth and confronts the Pope on trying to excommunicate them over this, he concedes to Polycarp.
Right.
So it's not that he didn't agree. He agreed that this was wrong, that this was the wrong way to celebrate it. Pope Antecedus was not approving of this, but he still concedes to Polycarp, even though he believed this to be wrong. He believed Asia Minor to be in error.
Yeah, because from the earliest times of the church in the West believed that the churches in the East could have their own liturgical traditions in the same way that the Eastern Catholic Church that I belong to has its own liturgical commemorations that don't line up with the Western liturgical commemorations.
Then why would you ever argue that Victor was? So it's either Victor was right or Antecedus was right. Which one was right? Because Victor believed he did have that authority.
No, Antecedus did as well. He just chose not to exercise it in the same way that Victor chose not to exercise it. Because when they both found out that the reason they were celebrating it on the day was because John and Philip, the apostles, were using that calendar, they both said, okay, so it's a human apostolic tradition. We can let it be. Human apostolic traditions don't have to be changed. But they can be because, for example, the churches in Asia Minor eventually did change that tradition, and they moved over to the Julian calendar as well at the Council of Nicaea. So even traditions that come from the apostles themselves, if they're human apostolic traditions, not divine apostolic traditions, they can be changed if it's necessary. It's rare, but it has happened.
But the point is that it was over the same issue.
Right.
And you have one pope. We have one pope who again, decides not to exercise only when Polycarp comes and vouches for him.
Yeah, and the same
then
thing
you- but-
happened with Victor, because Saint Irenaeus came to vouch for
Right.
the church in
Yes.
Asia Minor. Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah, because the popes just weren't aware that that was the tradition of the apostles. They just didn't know. So when they found out that it was, like I said,
that
they
doesn't
let it be.
answer
They
what-
said, okay.
That doesn't answer why Pope Anicetus was comfortable conceding to another see.
That isn't something that's out of the ordinary. If he was able to concede to another see, it just means that he said, okay, this other see is correct. That's actually a really
that's
good.
The point. He
that's-
didn't believe he was correct. Hang on, that's the point though. He didn't believe that he was correct. He believed that they were still wrong. The Asian minor churches were wrong, but he still concedes to Polycarp.
Because this isn't a matter of divine apostolic tradition. It's a matter of human apostolic tradition. Because even Pope Victor, same thing. He believed that they were wrong, but he still let them be, because it's not a hill to die on. It's not an issue of what is revealed by God. This isn't my cross exam, but I would say that the date of Easter isn't something that was revealed. It's not in the Bible. It's not in the deposit of faith. It's not in a sacred tradition. It's these are human traditions that came from the apostles, in the same way that, like, the sign of the cross is a human tradition, and those can be let be. But again, if the Pope wanted to, he could change them, and they have been changed over the last 2,000 years. Some human apostolic traditions, for example, like facing ad orientem during the liturgy, that goes back to Christ and the apostles, but not all of the apostolic churches do that anymore. And that's fine.
I'll let the audience make their determination on that one. All right, let's move on. So Thomas Aquinas was heavily influenced by papal forgeries in his work against the errors of the Greeks. The Council of Trent references them in session 22 to justify the Pope as the sole source of jurisdiction in the Church, and Pope Leo IX references the donation of Constantine in his letter to the Patriarch of Constantinople on the eve of the schism in 1054. So my question for you is, you wouldn't forge a deed to a house if you already own the house, and you certainly wouldn't use a forged deed to prove you own a house that you legitimately own. So why did a supposedly infallible council and multiple highly influential Western saints reference forged documents to prove the papacy?
Well, if you actually go back to and I'm going to answer your question, but I just want to say that everything that proves the papacy can be found in in most of the councils before those documents were forged. And the infallible councils, this is what everyone needs to understand, is that infallibility only pertains to matters of faith and morals, not even matters of fact. So if a council is using forgeries, and let's say that a council pronounces on matters of doctrine, on dogmatic matters of faith and morals, those decrees that the councils, or even the Pope by himself, those decrees that are made, are protected by the Holy Spirit, and they're not going to be wrong, even if the documents that are being used are spurious. So the church isn't protected in matters of fact. The church is only protected, only infallible in matters of faith and morals. In the same way that when the Council of Ephesus condemned Nestorius as a heretic, we know now, looking back, that the council was actually incorrect. It turns out that Nestorius wasn't a Nestorian, but the council still condemned him as a Nestorian, and they were wrong. In the same way that when Constantinople III condemned Honorius, we actually know now that Honorius didn't hold to that heresy. The council was wrong, because councils can err in matters of fact, because there isn't anything in divine revelation that says that Honorius is a heretic or Nestorian is a Nestorian. There's nothing in divine revelation that says that. So the church can err in those kind of matters.
Okay, so a couple of things. First of all, Nestorius was not a Nestorian in the sense that he believed that Christ was two persons, but he did reject the term Theotokos. And that is what makes him logically still a Nestorian. So it was correct to condemn him as a heresy and guilty of that heresy. But I didn't feel like you answered the actual question.
So that was the famous Nestorius is not a Nestorian clip that you guys have probably seen. And David Erhan just did a excellent video on this particular topic that I dropped in the comments for you guys to check out. That disproves that. It shows that Nestorius was indeed a Nestorian.
That I'm really trying to get at, which is why were these forgeries? Specifically, let's zero in on Pope Leo IX. When he references the donation of Constantine, he doesn't reference the letter of he doesn't reference the letter of Pope Celestine, doesn't reference the letter of Pope Agatho. His justification is the donation of Constantine. So why did he feel the need to utilize something that doesn't exist? I'm not saying he thought it was legitimate, but why did he feel the need to reference something that had stronger language than these other genuine examples?
I would even go as far as to say that he did think it was legitimate, because everyone in those days thought that it was legitimate.
I'm conceding that.
Yeah,
I'm conceding that.
and the reason that he appealed to it is because the truths that are found in those forgeries are still true, because they're actually already found since the very beginning of the church, before those forgeries were ever even written. So if you find a forgery that says something in it that happens to be true, you can't be faulted for using the forgery, because the one thing that it says that is true can be proven throughout the last 2,000 years. And as far as the donation of Constantine goes, there's something that I could actually flip to that I can read really quick. It says this: donation of Constantine. Scholar Henry Chadwick says that. One quick second. I'm trying to find. And if you wanted to move on, I don't want to eat up your time.
Yeah,
But there's a
all
scholar
right,
here. Yeah, go ahead. No problem.
Actually, go ahead. Read a quotation.
I'm just trying. I'm trying to find it. It's right here, like on page. I think it's on page 120. Let me find it really, really quick. I really don't want to eat up your time, man. So if you want to, let me see if I could find
all
it.
right. Yeah. All right.
Go
So the Constitutum of Vigilius, which Constitutum of Vigilius was ex cathedra if both meet the requirement?
So the Constitutum of Pope Vigilius, actually, they all taught the same thing. And let me explain.
That's incorrect.
Well, no, actually, let me explain how they actually did. Because the documents that Pope Vigilius wrote during the Council of Constantinople II, they all maintained the Orthodox faith. This is where we get into the distinction between matters of revealed doctrine and matters of fact. So we know that in one constitutum, he rejected the 3 chapters, right? In the first one, he rejected the 3 chapters, but that caused a schism in Rome. So he pulled it back because he didn't want there to be a schism in Rome.
That was the Judicatum.
The Judicatum, I'm sorry. And then in the next one, right, he was trying to defend the 3 chapters. But how did he do it? When he wrote the second document, he was defending the 3 chapters by trying to make them sound orthodox, trying to make them sound in line with Pope Leo's tome. So whether he was rejecting the 3 chapters or whether he was trying to defend the 3 chapters, what he is doing in both of those instances is maintaining the orthodox.
So this is just not true. And my response, I didn't press him hard enough on this, but like he very clearly is attempting to bind on faith and morals, not just matter of fact. So first of all, it's very clear he's attempting to bind the universal church. So he says, we ordain and decree that it be permitted to no one to write or bring forward anything contradictory to the contents of this constitutum, or after this declaration begin a new controversy about them. And if anything has already been done in contradiction to this our ordinance, thus we declare void by the authority of the Apostolic See. So Vigilius, this is his first constitutum, that this is the thing that he later says Satan was influencing him on. But in this first constitutum, he attempts to bind the universal church, and he explicitly says, from the reading of the text of the letter produced by his adversary, his writing has been shown to be Catholic. So he is accepting this letter, which was deemed heretical, which he admits later is heretical, which is why he says, again, that he was under the influence of Satan. But this is not a matter of fact. This is a matter of faith and morals. That's what this is, faith and morals. And he just attempted to bind the universal church to it, and he made an error, and he admits that he made an error, which is why he says that Satan was influencing him, which I showed that quote earlier. It's under my stream here. Right here. He blames the enemy of the human race. This is you and you can go read the full this full section. But he says Satan was influencing him, and then he annulled it. He annulled the first constitution.
Orthodox faith, the faith of Chalcedonian Christianity. In the same way that the council can err in rejecting Pope Nestorius, by condemning him, he could technically err by affirming something that might be in substance heretical, but his understanding of it would actually be be Orthodox. Because again, they're not
Okay.
infallible in matters of fact; they're infallible in matters of faith and morals, matters of doctrine.
Okay, so I just want to really clarify for the audience the timeline here. So then I'm going to ask my question that has to do with this,
Yeah.
because I really need to clear this up. The Judicatium was 2 years prior to the council. It moderately condemned the 3 chapters.
Right.
Then during the council, he issues his first constitutum, which does condemn the 3 chapters. But however, he tries to maintain the 3 authors of the 3 chapters, as saints. He tries to maintain them as saints. So then the council, in response back,
I was a little bit confused on theology here. Not saints, just not guilty of the heresy. That's what they were trying to maintain them as. So I was a little bit wrong about that. Again, I was an inquirer at the time.
says, you don't have this apostolic authority over us. 2 is better than 1. The whole quotation I read. And so then they proceed to condemn the authors of the 3 chapters as heretics. And then a year later, or a little less than a year later, is when Vigilius issues his final constitutum, which does contradict his former one, because it does say that the heretics, the 3 authors, were heretics. So you do have one that says they were not heretics and one that says they were. They're conflicting constitutums. So which one was the true one that was asserted by the apostolic authority?
So they contradicted themselves in matters of fact, but not in matters of faith. He was defending the Orthodox faith in both. So you could pick either or. The one where he accepted them as saints is fine. The one where he rejected them is fine, because he was still upholding the Orthodox faith. Just like Nestorius really wasn't a Nestorian and they condemned him wrongly. Pope Honorius wasn't really a heretic either. They condemned him wrongly. You can technically affirm something that maybe is heretical. And I do believe that the 3 chapters were heretical. But if it's the interpretation that you give is orthodox, that interpretation of the Orthodox faith is what stands. So you can pick either or. The Orthodox faith still stands.
So you would not put a saint, someone either being a saint or a heretic. This means that someone that could be interceding for you, or they're literally a heretic. Those are the 2 options. And you're saying that's not a matter. That's just a simple matter of fact. That's not a matter of faith.
A simple matter of fact would be that somebody is in heaven interceding for you.
No, I'm saying the issue at hand is whether or not these individuals are either interceding for us or they're heretics. That's right. And you're saying that's just a small little matter of fact. That's all that is.
Right. So those 3, the 3, Theodore Mopsuestia, Theodore Red, and the other guy, they could be. It's possible that they are in heaven interceding for us.
So if he was correct that this wasn't a matter of faith and morals, he would be right about this. But it was a matter of faith and morals, as I just showed.
Even if the church doesn't recognize them as being in heaven as interceding for us.
That's irrelevant to the point. The point is that you're minimizing the distinction between the disparity between the first constitutum and the second constitutum. You're saying it was just a simple matter of fact, but this is much larger than a matter of fact. This is 3 individuals who could be interceding. People could have been asking for intercession. I mean, and so this is not a small little matter of fact. This is significant.
Right. So the point of the writings was actually...
Let's just keep it in the form of questions again as a reminder.
Okay. Got you.
Right. So the point is to, of the writings was to obtain the Orthodox faith. Whether the writings were going to canonize these guys as saints or not is actually a separate matter. And eventually they decide on not considering them saints. But that doesn't mean that they're not saints. It's possible that they could be saints. The church just doesn't recognize it.
Okay, but you're missing the overarching point here.
I would say that they didn't condemn them to hell because the church has never condemned anybody to hell.
Okay, but here's what I'm asking, right? Is the authority of the Apostolic See was appealed to when he was making when he releases his first constitutum.
Right.
He says no one ought to question this going forth by the authority of the Apostolic See.
Right.
So we can move on. My next question has to do with this, so I'm going to stay right here.
Okay.
So in the Fifth Ecumenical Council, in response back to Vigilius, states there's no other way to resolve matters of faith but in a council with conciliar discussion. How do you reconcile that with Vatican I?
They wrote that to Vigilius, right?
They wrote back to Vigilius, and they say they literally say there is no other way to resolve matters of faith but in common discussion. Well, this is their response. This is the response to Vigilius when he tries to implement his apostolic authority.
This was after the second one, right? Where he's trying to.
This is the first. This is the Constitutum. This was
well,
the one that he gave them. You're thinking of the Judicatium 2 years prior. This
Right.
is the Constitutum
The
that
con-
was at
that's
the
what I
actual
mean.
council itself. Yes.
Right. So when I say that the second one, I mean the second of the three, because there were three of them.
Yes. Yeah.
So I would just say that Pope Vigilius, he rejected that. He rejected what they wrote back to him because he continued to write against the council, and he continued to make decrees apart from the council, and he considered them to be authoritative. So just because the acts of the councils might say this, because the Roman emperor said something, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's true.
So to be blatantly clear, are you saying the bishops of Constantinople II were wrong to say that the only way to resolve matters of faith is in a council? Are they wrong?
Yes, because there were matters to resolve faith before the issue of Constantinople II that took place that were not in the council.
So that's an accepted decree of an ecumenical council that he just said is wrong. Do you understand that? That is the formal decree of Constantinople II, accepted by the Roman Catholic Church. He just said it's wrong. This is extraordinary magisterium. It's infallible. It can't be wrong. And he just said it's wrong.
All of the times that the bishops of Rome were able to universally settle matters of doctrine.
Okay, and you also said that he continued to stand by his first constitutum, but he doesn't. So how do you reconcile that answer with the fact that he finally does submit to the council when he releases his second constitutum?
Well, first of all, I would say that he didn't submit to the council. If you go back to my opening statement where I talk about it, his writings don't even mention the council by name. He ratifies it, but he doesn't submit to the council. In fact, he finally condemned the 3 chapters by his own authority without mentioning the council. So he finally ratified the council, but in his writings, it was clear that the buck stopped with him, and he wasn't doing it because the council said you had to do it. He was doing it because he wanted to do it because he finally did it, and then he ratified the council because it agreed with him. If Pope Vigilius had never ratified the council, it would never be considered ecumenical by either the Catholic or the Orthodox churches.
Okay. So I think I get to respond to that without
of course,
the
go
formal
ahead.
question. Okay.
Yeah.
But the council didn't agree with him. That's the point. That's why the council was asserting this authority of over Vigilius. And you already said they were wrong to do that. But the point is, you just said the council agreed with him. No, they didn't. So how do you reconcile that?
Well, the council agreed with him in the sense that they wanted to condemn the 3 chapters, because you would say that the council condemned the 3 chapters, and then Pope Vigilius eventually condemned the 3 chapters as well, right? So they both eventually did the same thing.
No, the 3 chapters. It was over the authors. That was the disagreement. The council disagreed with Pope Vigilius about the 3 authors.
And like I showed earlier, it's not just the authors. It was, in fact, this letter that was heretical that Vigilius accepted. So that's faith and morals. He's accepting a letter that's talking about theology. That's faith and morals.
Right.
That's what they were disagreeing on.
Right. Yeah, and there could be a disagreement over, we don't want to canonize certain individuals as saints, and if the Pope wanted to, he could. But if he didn't want to, he doesn't have to, because again, just because the church doesn't canonize somebody as saints doesn't mean that they're not saints. They could still be in heaven praying for us. The church just doesn't officially recognize them. So it's not a hill to die on, is what I'm saying.
Well, okay, but the overarching point is a hill to die on, and that would be when they assert their authority over Vigilius. And then Vigilius, again, he does, and you can say submit, you can say affirm, but eventually he does affirm the conclusion of the council. And at no point do the patriarchs apologize to him for asserting their authority over him. At no point does he say they were wrong to do it.
I got clipped right there, and some sedevacantists clipped it, and they showed an example from before the council where the Patriarch of Constantinople goes to Rome and apologizes for something completely separate. It was before this council, and then Pinesap's dumbass posted it, and there was like edits made of it, and it was about an incident that happened before this council. So I'm correct. They never apologize for asserting their authority over the Pope at this council. And the Patriarch going to Rome like 3 years prior is not relevant to that point. So Anyways.
He just writes his second constitutum, and which does submit to what the council also decided.
Let's say that it agreed with what the council decided, not that he submitted to it, because again, in that second constitutum, he doesn't even mention the council by name.
Right. It agrees with the council and contradicts his first constitutum.
Right. Yeah. And that's fine. That can happen because again, the point of it wasn't to, it's not like the council was saying, Pope Vigilius, you need to condemn these guys to hell. Pope Vigilius is just now saying, we're not going to recognize them as saints. And that's all it is. And that's fine because the Pope doesn't need to recognize every person as a saint. Again, it just wasn't the hill to die on for Vigilius.
Okay. Real quick. In the Sixth Ecumenical Council, was Pope Honorius not a heretic, or was Pope Agatho wrong to condemn him as a heretic? Which position do you take?
So Pope Agatho was wrong, and the council was wrong to condemn him as a heretic because, and I know that you popped up, that's actually not a big deal to say that, because councils can err in matters of fact, because Pope Honorius being a heretic isn't.
He's also contradicting himself here, because earlier in the debate when he said that when Rome makes a decision, it's final, and he was arguing that that's what Sardica was saying. So is it final or is it not final? Like, bro.
Something that is in the deposit of faith. There's nowhere in the Bible that you can turn to or an apostolic tradition that you can go to that says Pope Honorius is a heretic. So if the council can be wrong in condemning Nestorius, it could be wrong in condemning Honorius. It was wrong in both counts. And the fact is that councils can err. Not everything that they say is infallible. Only things that are part of the deposit of faith, matters of faith and morals.
All right, that ends the cross-examination. Let's go ahead and transition to audience Q&A. Y'all make sure to send your questions to @reason and theology. If you don't put @reason and theology at the beginning, I likely won't recognize it as a question. So go ahead and send those. I do see a few already.
Are we doing questions before closing statements? We're going to do closing statements after?
Correct. Questions before. At least that's what I had when y'all sent it to me. Unless y'all want to change
I'm good with
that.
either.
I'm fine.
I'm good with either.
Yeah, we can do questions first. This is the most fun that I've ever had in my life. And I'm like not lying. Luigi, brother, you are my soulmate. I love you. Let's keep doing this every day for the rest of our lives.
I'll say,
I needed this. I need somebody that can. I need you. Let's keep doing this, please, because this is like
little weird knowing what we know now. Just saying.
Like a blast. This is, this is everything I wanted this to be. So thank you, Luigi, man.
I'm having a good time too, and I give you credit because you found a hole in my knowledge, which is the late 7th century thing. I'm gonna have to do more on that. But
late 7th century, what?
The issue you were talking about in the late 7th century after Lateran 649. I gotta study that more. So
okay, I gotta do a bunch of studying too, man.
Yeah.
you are my hats off to you, brother. You are the man.
So here's a question for both of y'all. Alex, since you're normally starting first, I guess I'll just start with you first, then propose the same question to Luigi. If we ought to reunite, under which conditions would that have to be? So starting with you, Alex.
Well, we have plenty of examples in history of East and West reuniting, with the Eastern Catholic churches. I would say, what Pope Benedict XVI has said on the matter, what Pope Francis has said on the matter, all of the dogmas that the Catholic Church has defined, the Eastern churches would have to recognize, but the Eastern churches get to keep everything else, their liturgies, their traditions, their spirituality, their customs. They get to keep all of it. So the Eastern churches, for them to come back into communion with Rome, they don't lose anything. They don't have to lose anything. They're actually just gaining more. So I think that when you express it in that way, I think that's a pretty attractive proposition. If you're an Eastern Orthodox, if you're an Eastern Christian, and you say, wow, I get to keep everything that I have, and then I get the universal magisterium, and I get all of these other issues cleared up that the magisterium has already settled, that's something very attractive.
And same question to you, Luigi.
Yeah.
Pretty sure I make a blunder here. I think I say something dumb about how the filioque wasn't a big theological issue or something stupid like that.
I think ecumenism can be dangerous if it's unity just for the sake of unity. We need to have unity over doctrine, right? And I'm not saying you're not saying that. I think you are. I would say that the simple answer is we need to revert to the church of the first millennium. and that is Rome. Rome would be the first see, with an acknowledgement of a conciliar model with the other now. Well, we have 9 patriarchs in the East now. And I would say that the filioque would need to be removed from the creed, but can still be affirmed theologically. That's how I would answer that question.
Okay. So here's one for you, Luigi. Can you elaborate?
So obviously I'm wrong about that. Again, I was an inquirer. The other thing too is like unity of doctrine is necessary, and it's wrong that what I said that he was saying that is incorrect, because he's talking about Eastern Catholics. Eastern Catholics don't have unity of theology with the Latin Rite, and with the, what some would just call Roman Catholics. I call them all Roman Catholic. So they don't have unity of theology. So that's just wrong. And they don't recite the filioque. So the Pope, when he visits Eastern Catholic churches, doesn't recite the filioque. So so cut me some slack. Obviously that was wrong on my part.
Your response for why the Eastern Orthodox have had no ecumenical councils in the past 1,000 years, or did you say one? Not sure, but thank you and God bless you.
Yeah, God bless, brother. So I would say a couple things to that. Yeah, I mean, so they would not call it an ecumenical council. They would call it a pan-Orthodox council, the 1672 Council of Jerusalem, which is received for all intents and purposes as ecumenical. However, they just don't nominally refer to it as ecumenical. I would say that a large reason is there's a sealed set of dogma that the ecumenical council served a purpose in, and that can't be touched. And that is what is upheld, I believe, by the Eastern Orthodox Church. And so I would say there is a magisterium in regards to interpreting certain things, but there isn't this development of doctrine that we see, I believe, in the Roman Catholic Church.
Y'all send some more questions for Alex, because I'm seeing a disproportionate amount for Luigi.
They're probably sick of hearing my voice. They're probably sick of hearing my voice, Michael.
Well,
they're probably sick of me. So I have no problem because Luigi's the brand new guest. So if they want to hear from him, brother, no issues with me, man. Let's Luigi take the stage.
Let's get it. Let's make sure to get it balanced here. So I did see one for you. They ask Alex, can you explain Nestorianism again?
Oh, well, Nestorianism is the heresy that splits Jesus into two, that there's a divine Jesus and there's a human Jesus. And the Orthodox view is that Jesus in his divinity is also fully man, and Jesus in his humanity is also fully God. And it was condemned at the Council of Ephesus in 431, and they condemned the heresiarch Nestorius. But it turns out now the consensus in the scholarship is that Nestorius wasn't actually a Nestorian, and it was the Council Fathers that misunderstood him. So they wrongfully condemned Nestorius.
Yeah, again, this is just wrong. David Erhan just did a video on this. And there's plenty of things that consensus of scholars are wrong about. What does the consensus of scholars say about the Gospels? They say that they're anonymous. The consensus of scholars says that, most of the Pauline epistles weren't written by Paul. Like things like this. So like we don't start, especially when it comes to church judgments, we don't take scholarly consensus. That's not what we rely on. So it's helpful, but it's definitely not where our epistemology, it's not our first principle, that's for sure. So yeah, David Erhan just did a video. You guys can look at that up on YouTube.
But they rightfully upheld the Orthodox faith, which is what me and Luigi were really contending over in the matters of Constantinople II and Pope Julius.
Let's see. Question for both of y'all. What single argument from the opposing side keeps you both up at night the most? Starting with you, Alex.
What single argument keeps me up the most? That's a really good question.
I got an answer if you want to think.
Go for it, man. You first. So I need to think about that.
So you can think about it. Yeah. For me, I would say it's the language of Ephesus and Nicaea II, and I guess Constantinople III, when it talks about the See of Rome will never err. I would say that's a good argument, but the problem with that argument would be the absolute language that we see with the emperor as well. So I would say it's a good argument. I commend papal apologists for using it. I just don't believe it ultimately holds water.
You know what? Actually,
and there's another quote. So this is from Constantinople 869, which the Roman Catholics, it's their 8th ecumenical council, and it literally says, God established his church in 5 patriarchates and decreed in his gospels that they would never at any time totally fall away, since they are the heads of the church. For the saying, and the gates of the underworld will not prevail against it, has this meaning. And I put this in the chat for you guys. So the same language that, and this is like this is like all these TikTok bros are running around with the same argument regarding Pope Agatho's letter, saying that Rome will never fall away. Well, their own council says that all 5 patriarchates will never fall away. So it's just special pleading. This is clearly just honorific language because it's used for every patriarch and the emperor as well.
would say maybe the thing that actually keeps me up the most, because this is actually true, this does keep me up the most, is the fact that schisms even happened. The fact that the Church of Antioch thought that it didn't need to be united to Rome. The fact that the Church in Alexandria thought it didn't need to be united to Rome. The fact that eventually the Church of Constantinople thought that it didn't need to be united to Rome. That keeps me up at night, because I'm like thinking, oh, well, if they didn't believe that it's necessary to be united to the Pope, maybe it's not necessary to be united to the Pope. Maybe it's not true. So just the fact that these schisms have persisted since the 5th century, that keeps me up at night, and that's a tough one.
Voice of reason. At least 3 ecumenical councils anathematized Nestorius, and you claim he was wrongly condemned. So are the ecumenical councils fallible and the Pope infallible?
The ecumenical councils are infallible when it comes to matters of faith and morals, but ecumenical councils can err when it comes to matters of fact. Like, for example, the Ecumenical Council of Nicaea II also used...
the citation wasn't included on that one, so here's the full quote and the citation for those that are watching on the recording. And this is from my Ultimate Orthodox Quote Mine, which I will repost for you guys so you can go check that out, because it deals with a lot of these special pleading arguments that they will use for papal honorifics. So you guys can check that out.
Certain forgeries as well, right? And we know that they're forgeries, but those forgeries were still used at that ecumenical council. Are we going to say that Nicaea II is fallible because it used forgeries? No, we know that Nicaea II is infallible in what it decreed on matters of faith and morals, but that doesn't mean that every single thing that it says, or even the documents that it uses, are going to be always legitimate. Remember, the church is there to uphold the Christian faith. The church isn't there to be correct on every single matter of fact pertaining to every single person that has ever been in the church.
Question for Luigi. If the papacy was false, then why were the Eastern Orthodox in communion with it for so long? And you've done a great job.
Yeah, I mean, so the argument is not that the papacy itself is false. We obviously affirm Rome was the first see of the first millennium. What we would say is that Rome fell into error when they started affirming things that we don't find in the first millennium, such as authority over a council and not from the consent of the church. So the papacy is not contested by anybody. Everybody knows there was popes. St. Peter was the first pope. Nobody contests this. However, well, nobody that isn't a Protestant contests this. But what we would say is that this doctrine developed to a point that was not a reflection of the first millennium.
Okay, let's see. I'm scrolling through. There's a lot of questions here, trying to keep them balanced. So, okay, well, here we go. Let's start with you, Alex. But it's a question for both of you. What are your opinions on the Oriental Orthodox? Beginning with you, Alex.
I love the Oriental Orthodox. I love the Oriental tradition, and I'm really glad that those schisms have been partially healed. And I want the entire schism to be healed, and for all of the Oriental Orthodox to be in communion with Rome.
And you, Luigi?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of respect for the Oriental Orthodox tradition as well. I have obviously issues with their affirmation of Dioscorus when he affirmed Eutyches at Ephesus 449, which they now acknowledge to be a heretic. But he presided over that council, which was a clear robber synod. I mean, the Patriarch of Constantinople was literally murdered during that council. So the fact that their supposed true patriarch presided over that, I think, is a massive issue for them.
And if I could say one more thing about them real quick, Michael, I would say that Oriental Orthodoxy and the Assyrian Church of the East, both of those communions are actually more credible than even the Eastern Orthodox communion, just because they only have 400 years of having accepted the papacy, so they have less instances of accepting the papacy than the Eastern Orthodox have. So I think that they are kind of more credible in that sense.
And you guys will see this. The OOs and the Roman Catholics will do this little kumbaya where they're like, oh yeah, Chalcedon is, it's a papal council, and that's why we reject it. And so you guys are totally right about Chalcedon. And they do this little kumbaya thing to try to stick it to EOs. And by the way, they almost never debate each other. I think there's finally a video coming out of Roman Catholics debating against OOs. But it's always us. And by the way, David Erhan is about to debate Agan on the 2nd, I believe, May 2nd. So you guys can tune into that. But we're always the ones that got to debate these guys. And it's the Roman Catholics, you guys have the same issues. You still have to defend Chalcedon. And a lot of these Roman Catholics will just throw Chalcedon under the bus because they think it proves their papal. They think they can use that to prove their papal claims. So, anyways, it's just funny how they do this little kumbaya session.
It's because they broke away a lot earlier than them, if that means anything.
Luigi, follow up for that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that they don't have a definition of an ecumenical council, and that's I believe the only consistent definition of an ecumenical council is the Eastern Orthodox when they say it has to be affirmed by every patriarch. And so I would say that they fall short of that. So yeah.
Yeah, we are literally the only ones that have a consistent system on what it means to be an ecumenical council, because the Roman Catholics have gone back and forth on this so many times. Like I said, Lateran 649 alone disproves their paradigm that if a pope is attempting to call an ecumenical council, then it's ecumenical. But when he tried to do it, it's not considered ecumenical by even their own church. So we're the only ones that have a consistent, internally consistent definition of what makes a council ecumenical.
I would disagree with that.
Michael, would you let me ask him a quick question, or do we need to move on?
As long as Luigi's okay with it.
Are you okay with
Sure.
it, Luigi?
Yeah.
So you're saying that the Eastern Orthodox definition of an ecumenical council is that it has to be affirmed by every patriarch, but then you claim that the council that happened in the 17th century they don't call it ecumenical, but it's by all purposes ecumenical. How is that possible if the Patriarch of Rome wasn't involved? Can you explain that to me?
Yeah. So, so the same way we would say that the Fifth Ecumenical Council was ecumenical, they saw the See of Rome as empty, and so this is why at Nicaea II, when it specifically gives credit to that council as an ecumenical council, it says it was affirmed by the 4 patriarchs. Doesn't mention the Pope. This is in Nicaea II, and I would say.
So I just flashed that on the screen. The link here to the article from Ubi on what makes council ecumenical, and I also put the link in the chat.
It also, one other qualifier, it has to be intended to be an ecumenical council. Just because something is affirmed by every patriarch doesn't automatically mean it's ecumenical. It has to be intended to be ecumenical and affirmed by every patriarch.
We can move on. There's another question I wanted to ask you about Constantinople I then, but we can move on. I don't want to turn this into another Q&A.
I was talking about Constantinople II, but yeah.
Yeah, but Constantinople I, when it first happened, it wasn't ecumenical, and it was later elevated to be ecumenical. So that's the question that I would have. But we can move on, Michael.
Last word for Luigi, and then we're moving on.
Even if that's true, there's no issue with that because reception theory.
No,
yeah, if you wanted to respond.
What was the point? Sorry, I got ADHD. I tuned out.
So you said that there has to be an intent to be ecumenical, right? But Constantinople I in 381 wasn't ecumenical. It was later elevated to be ecumenical. So I just would ask you how.
Yeah, I think I'm just wrong about that. Because no, it doesn't need to be intended. It can be accepted later as ecumenical. as long as that acceptance is accepting it as ecumenical. That's all that matters.
How that fits in with that
understanding
of.
I would just contest that. I would say that
Okay.
it was intended to be binding and ecumenical.
All right.
Go ahead.
No, you get the last word. I'm just
Okay.
letting Alex
Right.
know we're moving on after you. Yeah. Go ahead. You can finish up, Luigi.
Oh no, I'm good. We can move on. That was all I had on that.
Okay, gotcha. All right. So who in the Orthodox? Okay, so this is for you, Luigi. Who in the Orthodox Church has the authority to affirm councils if patriarchs disagree, or can they excommunicate each other if they disagree?
Yeah. So I mean, excommunication of another patriarch is. I mean, again, we see this all over the early church, the first millennium, and so like in the Meletian Schism, we see this occurring, and so I would say that that's not that absurd to have a patriarch excommunicate another patriarch. But in order for something to be binding, it has to be affirmed by every patriarch. So if 8 affirm it and the 9th doesn't, then it's not binding. And I don't know if they're referencing like the most recent between Rocor and Constantinople. If they are, this is actually very akin.
So if it's a valid patriarch, yes, they need all 9. But if they're deposing the 9th, if they're excommunicating the 9th, then you only need 8. But yeah, if it's a regular just matter and they're still affirming that that's a valid patriarch, you need all 9 for that.
Into what we see in the early church. I mean, I'm likely going Antiochian Orthodox, which is in communion with both Rocor and Constantinople. It's really just a political excommunication that doesn't affect the laity. And so it's very similar and akin to what we see.
I'm going to find my thread on this so that you guys can refute this properly, because this actually proves that the Orthodox Church is indeed the Church of the first millennium. The fact that there is territorial disputes. The same thing happened between Rome and Constantinople over Bulgaria. The district of Bulgaria was being contested. Rome wanted it, Constantinople wanted it, and Nicaea II gives it to Constantinople. And so like these schisms over territorial disputes are common, and they still maintain tangential communion, which is what I'm describing here, where every other patriarch is still in communion with both of them. It's just that they're not in communion with each other. So that's called tangential communion. And it doesn't affect the laity. I'll show you guys, an archbishop came out and clarified this, that the schism does not affect the laity. It just affects the formal commemoration.
See in the first millennium.
Alex, what do you think is Luigi's strongest argument? God bless.
I think he had a lot of really strong arguments. I think that he brought up a lot of the ancient canons, a lot of the specific instances in history that I think are good, but ultimately, I don't think that they prove what needs to be proven. I would probably appeal just to certain canons, but even the canons that you appeal to, like
I just dropped this thread in my chat, and let me repost it as well. So for those of you that are watching after the live, you can go and see this, but I refute this objection of which Orthodox Church. This is the particular example. So I explain what tangential communion is, and the Meletian Schism, which here's a graph that shows the Meletian Schism, and you show it's kind of a mess, but what it shows is that many were outside of communion with Rome, but were still in communion with others in the church. And then eventually what ends up happening is Rome ends up on the wrong side of the Patriarch of Antioch. They side with Paulinus, the rest of the church sides with Meletius and then Flavian. And then they end up submitting to the rest of the church and entering back into communion with Antioch at the end of the 4th century. So I explain all this stuff in this thread. And then let me show you guys also, this is going to take me a second to find, so I'm going to keep playing this because I have where the Archbishop clarifies how this doesn't affect the laity.
And 28 of Chalcedon, that still only gets you the second best, still with Rome being first. So it doesn't get you all the way. But nevertheless, I think he did have quite a few good arguments.
Another one for you, Alex. How do you reconcile the 5th Ecumenical Council not willing to define doctrine without an ecumenical council?
How do I reconcile the 5th council not can you not willing to define doctrine with? I don't think I understand the question. How
I'm
do
trying
I
to understand it too. How do you reconcile fifth?
not willing to define doctrine without an ecumenical
I
council?
think they're proposing that the Fifth Ecumenical Council
Here you go. So the Archbishop came out and clarified this. The decision of the Holy Synod to suspend the liturgical mention of the Patriarch of Constantinople's name during the liturgy, and the fact that we suspend concelebration with hierarchs of the Patriarchate of Constantinople does not imply a full breaking off of the Eucharistic communion. The lay people who come to Mount Athos or find themselves in churches of the Patriarch of Constantinople can take communion in them, but we refuse to concelebrate with hierarchs of the Patriarchate of Constantinople, since every time they mention the name of the Patriarchate during the liturgy, we have suspended it. So he's just saying that it does not affect the laity, and that you can go and partake in communion.
Believed that you could only define doctrine through an ecumenical council. In other words, you have to have an ecumenical council to define doctrine.
Okay. So, first of all, the Fifth Ecumenical Council, that was where a layperson, the emperor, he was calling all the shots. All of the patriarchs who were involved, he had them in his back pocket. They were patriarchs that were just going to agree with whatever he said. So I would say that the council is tainted in that regard. But ultimately, I could just say that the council would be incorrect. And again, don't be scandalized when I say that an ecumenical council can err in some respects, because an ecumenical council can be incorrect in things that have nothing to do with the revealed truth. There isn't anything in divine revelation that says that doctrines can only be defined or settled at an ecumenical council. And before the Fifth Ecumenical Council, you have plenty of instances where singular bishops and the Pope was able to define doctrine all on his own for the universal church without a council.
So he likes to talk a lot of smack about Emperor St. Justinian. What's really interesting is in Constantinople III, my computer's freezing now. In Constantinople III, Pope Agatho's letter, which they will cite as being ex cathedra, literally says that he is a saint. So, and I'll pull up the link here. I'll drop it in the chat here in a moment. Oh, here we go. Got it now. So this is right here on New Advent. Emperor Justinian, of pious memory, whose uprightness of faith exalted the Christian state as much as sincere confession pleased to God, and his pious memory is deemed worthy of veneration by all nations. So this is Pope Agatho's letter, which they say is ex cathedra. They cite it for their papal claims, and the guy he was just talking shit about is being called a saint to be venerated by all nations. And by the way, St. Justinian, he is a saint. But here in an ex cathedra statement, Pope Agatho is agreeing with that. So he just threw that whole council under the bus, the council they accept because of Emperor St. Justinian, who Pope Agatho says under what they consider ex cathedra to say is a saint. And yes, thank you for the comments, because he's a uniate. So they venerate formally, and he got corrected in his debate with Ubi on this. He got corrected by his own priest, who said that they do in fact venerate Saint Justinian.
The next question is for you, Luigi, and thank you for the super chat regarding Swansona's biblical Eliakim argument. How does Luigi answer if biblical witness towers over historical witness? Where does the East go from there? Have they collectively engaged that argument?
Yeah, I think he's referring to the Isaiah 22 typology with Matthew 16, which I grant. I do grant that he's fulfilling Isaiah 22, and I would say that first of all, I would direct you to the many debates that have been done on this topic already. Really good one by Seraphim Hamilton and Swan. They have a good discussion about this. I would grant the typology. That's how I would respond to that. I don't have an issue with that. And then I would point to every bishop being the high priest, and that Peter, again, is the prototype for what the bishop is. And this is true for every bishop, which again is why we see the lines of succession of non.
This is what I'm referencing. I just dropped the link in my chat. This debate was a slaughter. It was so bad for Swan. It was so bad that at the end, Seraphim Hamilton gets asked by Swan for advice on how to make his arguments better. I'm not joking. You can go watch this debate between Swan and Seraphim Hamilton on this very topic. And Swan gets absolutely wrecked by Seraphim Hamilton on that very question that person just asked.
Apostolic sees like Jerusalem, they always start with an ordination of Peter because he is the prototype, not a super bishop. He's the proto bishop for the entire episcopacy. Oh, you're muted. You're muted, I think, Michael.
Sorry about that. I pressed the wrong button. Yeah, the super chat is from Jacob for Luigi. Would you consider becoming Old Catholic? Why or why not?
No, absolutely not. No, I mean, I think the strong arguments at the schism, such as the 4 of the 5 patriarchs, obviously remaining Eastern, I think the arguments are much better for Eastern Orthodoxy than for Old Catholic. I also think that there's just a lot of doctrine that you'd have to deal with, and you'd have a hard time dealing with. So no, I would never consider Old Catholic over Eastern Orthodoxy.
Looking for a question here for Alex. Let's see. For Alex, Acts 15:19 council, James uses the word krino or judgment at the end of the council, same word used in Matthew 19:28. How is Peter the judge?
Well, it's quite simple because even in like other ecumenical councils, in most of them, the Pope wasn't even there. And it was delegates that the Pope had sent. And a lot of the delegates at the ecumenical councils weren't even from the Church of Rome. And they were able to make these definitive pronouncements. And they were indeed definitive because the Pope, still ratified them. So Peter was there. And James, I have no problem whatsoever with saying that James was the leader of the council, which would be appropriate because James was the first bishop there in Jerusalem. If James said, it's my judgment that this is the truth, and Peter accepted it, that right there is what we see. That's papal ratification, so there isn't an issue there.
Question for Luigi. Where does Matthew 18 say Jesus gave the keys to all the apostles? Bind and loose does not equal keys.
Yeah. So what I was saying was the power of the keys, which is to bind and to loose, is given to the whole church in Matthew chapter 18. And that's what I was specifically referencing.
I showed you guys Lateran 4. You can go look it up if you weren't here earlier. Lateran 4 explicitly says that the church's keys that Jesus Christ gave were given to the apostles and their successors, plural. Apostles and successors. So their own ecumenical council grants that they all have the keys.
Okay, for Alex, can you explain that Roman Catholic to Luigi that it is not Roman Catholic? There are different rites. Okay, so yeah, can you comment on the issue of different rites in Catholicism, Alex?
Well, I am fairly sure that Luigi is well aware that in the Catholic Church it's not just Roman Catholics. Usually, when non-Catholics refer to the Catholic Church as Roman Catholics, it just means all Catholics that are in communion with Rome. I understand that us Catholics, we get kind of, because there's not just Roman Catholic, there's Byzantine, Alexandrian, Armenian, Syriac Catholic, and that all that. It's a good example. This is a really good example of how words, even though we mean the same thing, how words can cause fights. Like at the ecumenical councils, like with Nestorius and with Pope Honorius, it happens even right here on these live streams with certain language that we choose to use. It's about what do you mean by the language, not just words themselves. It's what do you mean, which is also why Pope Vigilius did not contradict himself in matters of faith.
All right, so last question for each one of you, starting with you, Alex, please. Can you explain what doctrines have been dogmatized by a pope in the first millennium?
So in the first millennium, for example, St. Athanasius of Alexandria says that what was dogmatized at the Council of Nicaea had actually already been definitively dogmatized in the year 260 by Pope Dionysius. So Pope Dionysius was the one that in the year 260 gave the Orthodox Christology about Jesus Christ being fully God and fully man. And the Council of Nicaea actually just repeated what Dionysius had already said. But St. Athanasius, who was, again, the bishop of Alexandria, he was one of the patriarchs. He says the bishop of Rome already settled this on his own. And that was in the first millennium. So that's one example.
Last question here. So for Luigi, would the current schism between Constantinople and Russia be avoided if they were united underneath a universal bishop like the Pope?
Again, I would say no, and I would point to examples in history like the Meletian Schism, where Rome was on the wrong side of the schism. I mean, we're talking about the entire church was in communion with the true patriarch of Antioch, and the last ones to finally submit to the true patriarch of Antioch was Rome. And so, no, I would say that, first of all, no, and then second, I would say that, again, unity for the sake of unity is not the answer. I don't think anybody believes in unity for the sake of unity. We must preserve that which is true and orthodox.
Also, the SSPX have been denied bishops over and over and over again by the Pope. And so they're about to appoint their own bishops, which is an act of schism. So, like, in this case, the Pope is causing a schism. So not only do they have fake unity, but they don't even have that in some cases. They literally cause more schisms.
So, yeah.
All right, let's go ahead and begin with our closing statements here. So we got 5 minutes apiece, beginning first with you, Alex, and then Luigi. You'll have the final word.
All right.
All right,
All
perfect.
right.
Let me know when I can
Whenever
begin,
you're
Michael.
ready.
Okay, I will
Okay.
begin now. So first of all, I want to thank Ben for participating in this wonderful debate. It was so much fun. I enjoyed it so much. And of course, I want to thank Michael. I want to thank you for hosting it and moderating it. I hope that the viewers were edified and that everyone learned something today. The resolution of today's debate was that Vatican I, papal supremacy indeed existed in the first millennium before the East and West schism. In my opening statement, I demonstrated 12 unique ways in which the Bishop of Rome exercised universal supremacy in the first millennium, and then I went through each century one by one, giving example after example of each of these. I covered popes who were supreme in matters of doctrine on the universal level, popes who actively made authoritative decisions in Eastern territories, which included calling synods, annulling entire synods, deposing and appointing clerics, and excommunicating Eastern Christians, including bishops, patriarchs, and even entire patriarchates as well. I also presented examples of popes rejecting and anathematizing the teachings of other bishops, patriarchs, and synods. I also showed that popes were above church canons, presenting examples of popes who accepted and rejected individual canons or even entire canon lists at their own will and by their own singular and unique authority, which included the sole authority to ratify ecumenical councils and make them binding upon the universal church, which explains why the Orthodox have not been able to hold an ecumenical council for over 1,000 years since before the schism. I know that we just talked about the Pan-Orthodox Synod that happened.
I already refuted this. We just had one in 1998. We literally just had a universal council in 1998. So it's just not true. We've had multiple Palamite synods, Council of Jerusalem, all these ecclesial councils where we're addressing elections. Like, come on, man.
In the 17th century. However, Russia, the church in Russia, to my understanding, never accepted it as even a Pan-Orthodox Synod. The last time
Someone whispered in his ear that. That's not true, first of all, but he didn't say that the first time. That wasn't something he came up with. There's no way. But Russia accepted a modified version of it that was universally accepted. So just because the original confession was edited and then accepted after that, that's how it always worked in the first millennium too. That's how the formula for Hormistos was received. It was edited and then accepted. So they did accept it when it was edited.
That they had a council that all the Orthodox hold to was when they were in communion with the Pope of Rome. What the Orthodox claim as their highest earthly authority, they no longer have because they no longer have the Pope. And you can't have a universal council without the universal head of the Christian church. I successfully defended this thesis today. My opponent's job in this debate, because he held the negative view, was to disprove the case that I made. He didn't succeed in this endeavor entirely. I demonstrated that the popes always had a unique singular authority in the church, and all that he had to do was present one case of another church authority apart from the pope who had greater authority or even just equal authority to the pope. This authority could be any one bishop or even a synod or council of bishops that exercised legitimate authority over a pope that bound him to their decrees. All my opponent had to do was present one ecumenical council that was binding on the universal church that the pope did not ratify. But my opponent didn't do this because no one can do this, because those historical examples don't exist. Instead, my opponent presented objections that didn't fully hit the mark about what the resolution of the debate was, but they were more about side issues that were ultimately irrelevant. My presentation was untouched by most of his objections, and every objection that he made, I was able to answer in almost every objection. I was able to answer in the rebuttal period. He, however, was not able to do the same. I actually refuted the strongest objections that he made before he even was able to make them. He exerted a lot of his efforts on the Fifth Ecumenical Council, which I spent a considerable amount of time on in my opening statement, demonstrating that this particular event in history actually supports the Vatican I claims rather than does harm to them. During the cross-examination period, he had the perfect opportunity to point out the holes in my presentation and to help me realize how I've totally misunderstood the facts of history, but he was unable to do this. My opponent was unable to give entirely satisfactory answers to many of the questions that I asked him today. With all of that being said, though, I respect his efforts, and I have the utmost respect for him as a man of faith and for asking me to have this this debate. And I think that what we can all take away is that Vatican I is correct. Vatican I did not misrepresent history or make up claims out of thin air. Vatican I accurately and faithfully defined what was believed all along by Christ's church, not just in the first 1,000 years, but also in the second 1,000 years, and now into the third millennium. The conclusion here is that the papacy is and always has been what Vatican I claimed. The true logical conclusion is that everyone who believes and follows Jesus Christ, who desires to be united to him, should be and must be united to the divine office that he himself established during his ministry on earth, the office of his vicar, the Pope, the head of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church of Jesus Christ. Thank you again, and God bless everyone.
All right, thank you for that. Now let's start the timer over. Luigi, you're going to have the last 5 minutes for your closing statement whenever you're ready.
All right, sounds good. Yeah, I also do want to thank both Alex and Michael for having me on. I thank everybody that came over from TikTok to watch this, and as well as all of Alex's people that came over to support him, and just reading the comments briefly, it seems like everybody felt this was a very respectful debate, which I'm very happy about. And so I just want to thank everybody for just their hospitality, specifically you, Michael, and Alex, for just having a civil discussion with me. I will say that if all I had to do was to show an ecumenical council exercising authority over a pope, I believe I did that in the Fifth Ecumenical Council, and then Alex proceeded to tell me that council was wrong. If he says it requires the pope in order for it to be an ecumenical council, he'd have to contradict Nicaea II when it says that this was a authoritative ecumenical council by the affirmation of the four patriarchs of Constantinople, Jerusalem, Alexandria, and Antioch. In 1054, on the eve of the Great Schism, Pope Leo IX sends a letter to Michael I, the Patriarch of Constantinople. In this letter, Pope Leo IX cites a large portion of a document called the Donation of Constantine to justify his supreme authority over the East in regards to unleavened bread and fasting days. This document, after 100 years of being leveraged as a justification for cutting off communion with the Eastern churches, was later discovered to be a forgery. In fact, throughout the second millennium, papal forgeries were referenced even in ecumenical councils, such as Trent and Florence, to give merit to the papal claims of the West. I argue that this is the clearest testimony of the first millennium's genuine history falling short of Vatican I. Why forge a deed to a house you already own? Why didn't Pope Leo IX reference the letters of Pope Leo I, Pope Agatho, or Pope Celestine, for example? Pope Leo IX, on the eve of the schism, understood that he needed to leverage something stronger than the claims made in these letters in order to justify his autocratic authority. As a Roman Catholic, you have to argue that you were on the correct side of the Great Schism in spite of the fact that the schism was caused by a papal forgery. The reason papal forgeries were so heavily relied upon is due to the fact that the first millennium's genuine history simply does not include autocratic authority, as Vatican I asserts. Examples such as Pope Vigilius being overridden by the Fifth Ecumenical Council, Rome being on the wrong side of the Meletian Schism, and Pope Antecedus conceding to Polycarp are simply irreconcilable with Vatican I claims. The only way to coherently argue for the papacy, as Vatican I defines it, is to say that the seed was planted in Matthew 16 and this slowly developed until its culmination at Vatican I. However, Vatican I contradicts this claim when it states that this has, quote, been known since the beginning of the Christian religion, end quote. Therefore, the papal apologist has reached a catch-22. If they argue Vatican I is present in the first millennium, they contradict history. If they argue it was a development, they contradict Vatican I itself. To close, I will again read from the Fifth Ecumenical Council when the College of Bishops responds to Pope Vigilius' attempt to assert papal authority over the council. Please notice how they reply by stating there is no other way to resolve matters of faith except when together in a council, with the consent of the church. Quote, and to this end we brought to his remembrance the great examples left us by the apostles and the traditions of the fathers. For although the grace of the Holy Spirit abounded in each one of the apostles, so that no one of them needed the counsel of another in the execution of his work, yet they were not willing to define on the question then raising touching the circumcision of the Gentiles, until being gathered together, they had confirmed their own several sayings by the testimony of the divine scriptures. But also the holy fathers, who from time to time have met in the four ecumenical councils, disposed of by a fixed decree the heresies and questions which had sprung up, that by common discussion, when the matter in dispute was presented by each side, the light of truth expels the darkness of falsehood. Nor is there any other way in which truth can be made manifest than when there are discussions concerning the faith. End quote. Thank you.
There it is. There it is. So that is the famous debate between me and Voice of Reason from January of 2024. Trying to get my super chats here. About to go over super chats. Thank you for tuning in, you guys. This was a very successful stream as far as viewership. We broke both 160 and 170 for the first time, which again is pretty wild, considering I literally just launched my YouTube last week. So we'll go over here some of these super chats. Converts to Orthodoxy says, this papacy debate is perhaps my favorite one. I sat with it for a while, but it was a huge impact on me and my journey to convert to Orthodoxy. God bless you. Hope to see you in future debates. Yes, I do intend. I appreciate the subscribe on X. Oh, thank you for bringing that up. I have subscriptions set on X right now, and my debate notes are actually available there. And also my Venmo is in my description. So I know, like I said, I know the Streamlabs is only PayPal right now. So it's like a pain to like go to the separate link to send a super chat and all these things. This stream should carry me over to be able to finally be monetized on YouTube. So it's easier for you guys to send super chats in. But yes, I'm trying to do future debates. I'm actually trying to do a debate on either Israeli influence or immigration. And then maybe I'll come back and do a debate on the papacy again. I don't know, eventually, potentially. Crafted by Conviction says, congratulations on your viewership. Just started watching and subbed. Great points you're bringing up. Keep it going. Thank you, brother. I appreciate the support. In the filth, again, Super Chat said, Senate just added Costco rotisserie chicken to SNAP benefits. Is nothing sacred anymore. If you run for office, make Costco exclusive again. I will add that to my notes. I mean, I'm going to get rid of SNAP probably like altogether, or at least make people reapply for it. Lay Wants Truth says, what do you think about the argument for lack of diversity expressed in the liturgy of EOs? Uniformity proves EO isn't the church. Early church in different jurisdiction had differences. We do have some differences, such as language, and then the Western Rite has effectively the Latin Mass tradition. So we do have some differences that are, that represent also the similarities and differences in the first millennium. It's also kind of a funny objection because it's like, we get told we're not uniform, and then now we're getting told we're too uniform because we have the same liturgy, and it's just like I don't know. It doesn't quite follow for me, so I don't know. So anyways, with that, I am going to be not live on Saturday. This Saturday, I'm going to be traveling. However, I'm going to try to film a video to release at 2 o'clock on Saturday. So my next stream will be Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Back to the normal show. I think Thursdays are going to be my normal react days. So I'm going to react to a video on Thursdays, and then Tuesdays and Saturdays will be sort of my normal show. Thank you guys for making my launch a huge success so far. Very excited about where we're going. We're just getting started. Please like and subscribe if you have not yet. And also, my buddy Fearless Truth is live right now debating Muslims. So if you want another live to go to, I recommend that one. He's my boy, and he's awesome. With that being said, God bless. Christ is risen. And yes, I will see you guys Tuesday.